Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 63, with my guest co-host today, a new guest co-host to the show. So we're going to welcome her in to the friendly confines of the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, Claire Chandler. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Hassan. How are you?
Great. And so we're going to be talking about today, our book today, is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And opening from The Myth of Sisyphus, I'm going to start right off here. An absurd reasoning, absurdity, and suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are the facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. If I ask myself how to judge that this question is more urgent than that, I reply that one judges by the actions it entails. I have never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Galileo, who held a scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with the greatest ease as soon as it endangered his life. In a certain sense, he did right. That truth is not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. How to answer it? On all essential problems, I mean thereby those that run the risk of leading to death or those that intensify the passion of living, there are probably but 2 methods of thought, the method of La Police and the method of Don Quixote. Solely the balance between evidence and lyricism can allow us to achieve simultaneously emotion and lucidity. In a subject at once so humble and yet so heavy with emotion, the learned and classical dialectic must yield, one can see, to a more modest attitude of mind deriving at one and the same time from common sense and understanding. Suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. On the contrary, we are concerned here at the outset with the relationship between the individual thought and suicide. An act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as is a great work of art. The man himself is ignorant of it. One evening he pulls the trigger or jumps. Of an apartment building manager who had killed himself, I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed greatly since, and that the experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. Society has but little connection with such beginnings. The worm is in man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity in the face of existence to flight from light. Let me pull something together for you from The Myth of a Man, made up man such as it were, but a myth of a man who was about as slippery as an eel. From his Wikipedia entry, where all great men eventually wind up in our world today. And I quote directly, in Greek mythological telling, Sisyphus was the founder and first king of Ephyra, supposedly the original name of Corinth. King Sisyphus promoted navigation and commerce, but was avarice and deceitful. He killed guests and travelers in his palace, a violation of guest obligations, which fell under Zeus's domain, thus angering the god. He took pleasure in these killings because they allowed him to maintain his iron-fisted rule over Corinth. Now, beyond just being an iron-fisted tyrant, Sisyphus fooled the god of the underworld when he mistakenly died and got the god locked up in chains. He also tried to kill his brother, just to go for the trifecta. And he tricked the gods after death a second time and was allowed to resume life above the surface of the earth when he should have been transported down to Hades. Sisyphus was a rogue. Sisyphus was a liar. Sisyphus was a cheater. He cheated on his wife several times, and he was even rumored to be the father of Odysseus. And we read Odysseus's tale a few episodes ago on this very same podcast. But the most anyone knows about King Sisyphus is about his punishment. And of course, Camus references this in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, meted out by Hades. And Sisyphus's punishment was having to roll an immense boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down every time it neared the top, repeating this action for an eternity, hopefully getting more and more lucid the entire time. Camus states in The Myth of Sisyphus that when the average person thinks about Sisyphus, quote, he must imagine Sisyphus is happy because the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. I don't know about that. And we're going to have an argument with Camus a little bit, or at least I'm going to have an argument with Camus. I don't know what Claire's going to do, but I'm going to have an argument with Camus today. I got a bone to pick with existentialists, just like I got a bone to pick with Nietzschean nihilists and post-modern Derridians, all who come from the same genus, which has the same nasty root in the Hegelian dialectic. Anyway, I'm gonna pick a fight today, and my guest co-host Claire Chandler is going to help me unwrap what, after getting about 3/4 of the way through The Myth of Sisyphus, I finally determined, because I was looking for the right term, right? It is an apologia, justification, such as it were, of despair and futility. And we're going to explore what that means for leaders and followers and all of us in the West during, as I've said before on the last couple of episodes of this podcast this month, during this month of pride in our country. And like I said, I'm going to do this with my guest co-host today from Talent Boost, and she's going to talk a little bit about what all that means, Claire Chandler. Welcome to the podcast, Claire.
Thanks, Hassan. It's so great to be here.
So let's start off a little bit with who you are and what do you do and why did you decide to walk into this contra Trump that I'm going through with the body politic culture, the West, America, and maybe even that wily French Algerian Albert Camus. Why did you walk in here today?
It is not often anymore that I get to spend quality time with a deep thinker like yourself and really explore some of the great thinkers of our literature. It's been a long time, quite honestly, since I've had this pleasure. And so when we were introduced and got to talking, I thought, what a great opportunity to tap into that. My work, my practice is around helping leaders, helping their organizations find alignment, find their place in the universe. Kind of interesting because it's a little bit of a theme that Camus has explored. And I'm here specifically to really explore what the great books, the great authors can teach us about leadership, both leadership of self and leadership of others, because they are equally important in my mind. So it's interesting because a lot of what I focus on when I advise executive leaders and their workforces, their teams, I advise them on their quest for why, their quest for purpose, their alignment around a purpose. And I found myself almost smirking throughout The Myth of Sisyphus because, of course, his core thesis is around the absurdity of that notion. And so we won't get to the punchline, I'm sure, until a little bit deeper into the conversation. But I found myself drawing parallels between what he is exploring and thinking aloud about, and I think he would side with you on some very heavy criticisms of Nietzsche. That was abundantly clear throughout his manifesto here. But yeah, so I'm here for all of that, and I'm here for doing that at a deeper level. So I've been very much looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. You're here for it all. Well, that's good, as the kids say. You're here for it all. So we're gonna go off. Lately, I guess people have been saying go off and be a hero. I've heard that from my 25-year-old. So I guess we're gonna go off and be heroes today. I guess that's what we're going to do. I want to ask a follow-up question here. So you talked about leadership of the self, right? And this is something that is part of an overarching idea for this year in the podcast. So if you go and listen to our very first episode that we put out for this year on January 1st, and I said this was going to be the year that we're going to talk about taking action, right? Because a lot of the critiques of this podcast are that we are maybe too intellectual. Maybe we're thinking too deeply, right? We're not oriented enough towards action, and no action, at least in my opinion, as a leader, can take place unless you do some thinking first. As we talked about most recently in our episode on Saint Augustine and the City of God, Augustine talked about action all the time. Matter of fact, the act of rhetoric and the act of argumentation was his action, right? But he was, of course, operating under a rubric of classical discourse, right? Not the same rubric we operate under. But what Augustine did so effectively was he cleaved and he clarified, right? He separated, he made clear, and he said, this is the way forward. In self-leadership, in order to take action in leading yourself, which I fundamentally believe, by the way, you have to do before you can lead others, it's incredibly important to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, that's the cleaving, and to clarify what you're about, that quest for your why. Have you found that leaders struggle with doing that?
Almost without exception, I have found that leaders struggle with that as they ascend to higher offices in leadership. I have found that they get further and further disconnected from what is at their core, and they start to look outward from themselves for what it means to be a leader. They seek to emulate. They seek to, when done wrong, they seek to mimic what they think of as the charismatic leader, the followable leader. And it is part of why I focus my work on what I do. It's to help them to reconnect to that. And it's interesting because this concept of leadership of self is a strong point of alignment with Camus in this work, I think, because one of his running themes is around the absurdity of looking for meaning outside of oneself and outside of the container that is this mortal life.
Yeah.
And I think he challenges all of us, and it's part of what I do to challenge leaders, although not as eloquently as Camus, to search for that meaning within themselves first, that true, authentic, genuine meaning. And while they are sorting that out, be happy anyway. Which I think is an undercurrent of this entire book. But I agree with you wholeheartedly that leadership of self has to precede leadership of others if you are truly to be a leader to be followed.
I would question Camus' orientation, and I did this throughout the book, by the way. And he went on a whole rip, in the first part. We might cover a little bit of this today. By the way, as usual, as I always say, we will not be reading the whole book because there's no possible way we can. Go get your own copy of the Myth of Sisyphus and read for yourself. Okay, now I've said the thing. I've said the disclaimer. He goes on an entire rip against Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard wrote about orientation from a Christian perspective, but not like a pastor in a church, although he did have a pastoral and theological background, Kierkegaard did. And he came out of that in Europe. I believe his father was a pastor as well, so he was raised in the Lutheran faith, if I remember correctly. And if I'm wrong, everybody can correct me on that. But either way, anyway, Kierkegaard was sort of I think I'm sort of a secular Christian apologist. Think of it in that sort of mode. I'm wanting to have Christianity without Jesus, right? But what Kierkegaard talked about was the orientation, and that the orientation, before you could even find yourself, had to be outside of yourself, right? You had to look out, or not look out, look up, right? Before looking out or before looking in. Okay. And this next section we're about to read, this next piece we're about to read, Camus had a strong critique against that. A, because Camus was an atheist moralist, but also B, because he didn't consider or didn't think that external orientation mattered much. I disagree with Camus. I think the external orientation does matter. I think it matters quite a bit, because I take, Nietzsche would appreciate this. I take the Old Testament position that the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can know it? And so if you're constantly looking inside of yourself for the orientation for where you need to be, you're gonna miss your compass. And so I say all that as a preface to this follow-up question. In what ways have you seen? No, not in what ways. Are leaders more or less successful when they have the orientation first, and then they try to find themselves second? Or does it need to be reversed? Do they need to find themselves first, and then the orientation will come?
So I think it's a little bit of a mixture of both, right? So there's this almost overly used phrase now, this concept of being the servant leader, right?
Yeah.
To be a servant leader or a purpose-driven leader, you do have to be outwardly focused. You have to have an outward orientation that takes into consideration those people you are trying to coalesce around a shared mission or purpose, right? So there very much has to be a focus outward. It can't all be about sitting in your corner office and doing reflection and thinking about yourself all the time.
Right.
However, I have found that the most successful leaders are authentic to what they truly believe at their core from their source. So we could go down that rabbit hole if you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
But around what truly orients them, so that when they are opening the door of their executive office and going out amongst the people,
Mm-hmm.
they can do that with conviction, not from a place of trying to convince people to follow them, right? And I think the only way that you can do that is to be very dialed in and aligned with what you are put in that leadership position to accomplish through others, but also being very aligned with what authenticity looks like for you. And there is no one size fits all in that regard. So I do think it is both. I think it is a muscle that has to be constantly exercised, otherwise it atrophies. And I think it is a discipline, right? It is a discipline to be self-reflective and somewhat self-corrective, maybe not self-critical, but self-corrective around, am I truly showing up the way that I intended, the way that I can live with, and the way that is true to me? And that's some of the questions that leaders that I work with flat out ask, right? At the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of their tenure at this particular role, have they done enough to show up in ways that make them proud, so that the leaders, the people behind them can truly follow them along a path that has meaning?
So, okay. So you said the word there, right? You said meaning, right? And we are in a meaning crisis. Fundamentally, this is a posture of myself and other guests who we have on this podcast, even some of the books that we read. But this is a fundamental posture that I take towards Western culture in our, in the year of our Lord 2023, right? We are currently in the midst of a meaning crisis. And by the way, a meaning crisis that Camus and many of Camus' ilk thought would only be temporary. So we covered Thus Spake Zarathustra on the podcast. So we've read Nietzsche, and we've looked at the Gulag Archipelago, and in a future episode we are going to be exploring Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. As somebody put it in talking about large language models that I was listening to on another podcast that I listened to the other day, and I want to give appropriate attribution. This was somebody else's words, not mine. We've spent 200 years in the West tearing down religion and tradition and God. And now we're at a point where we need to find meaning, or no, we need those rock ribbed structures to help us with the things we have created, and we don't have them. And so now we're going to go down the road of sort of a Greek level of divination, but we're going to make it technological divination, the AI with no mind behind it. I think Camus would laugh, but I think he would be joined in his laughter by a guy like C.S. Lewis. And I don't think that's a good thing, by the way. I also think that leaders have a responsibility. You talk about meaning. I think that leaders have a responsibility to define meaning, and leaders have a responsibility to define, and I'm going to go all out here, capital T objective truth. Like, we have to say this is objective truth. But I don't know that we're in a space to be able to do that. That's why I started this podcast. I don't know that we're in a space to be able to do that without referencing those books and referencing those arguments and referencing those ideas, because we have thrown out that tradition in an attempt to free ourselves from some imaginary shackles that we, in a Rousseauian fashion, believed we were in chains somewhere around, or trapped within. I shouldn't say around, trapped within. And this is where I get to, like, the sort of idea of suicide here, right? So he's talking about physical suicide, but he's also talking about, he mentions this later on in the book, psychological, philosophical, metaphorical suicide. This is my last question here. What happens when the suicide doesn't take? And I'm not asking this to be funny or cynical, but like we tried to commit suicide in the West at a societal level, and some would argue that is still going on. And I'll leave that aside for just a minute. But it doesn't seem to have taken, because there's always a problem. We'll go a little bit deeper into this a little bit later on, but there's always other people. There's always these other people who just don't buy into it. Like, he's got an entire passage in here, or not passage, entire section here about Don Juan. And I read this whole thing, and I thought, the first thing I thought was, only a man would think that.
Yeah.
Only a grown man who wanted to have sex without dating and fall into, like, would have thought Tinder was amazing. Only a grown man's going to write that, that's never actually been held responsible for his, shall we say, libertine behavior. And by the way, held responsible in all of the ways that men were traditionally held responsible for their libertine behavior. And yeah, I'm going here. Yeah, I am. When you watch the video of this, you'll see Claire's face.
No, because I want to double dog dare you now to make the subtitle for this episode that Camus was the grandfather of Tinder. I want to just double down on that.
Gotcha. Dare accepted.
SEO, baby. That's right.
Challenge accepted. I mean, that entire chapter on Don Juan is spoken exactly. It's written like a man who just wants to be a libertine. And
right.
Some woman would come along, any woman worth her salt would come along and you just want to be a libertine. And it's cool that you think like marriage is absurd, but it's going to be absurd. You try to get in my pants too. Like, that's going to be absurd too. What we could all be absurd together. How about that, sir? And I grew up around women. I kind of have I got a wife, I got daughters. I think I got a fairly,
Yeah.
I got to chip off the old block of reality about what a woman might say. And so there's other people, there's complications, there's behaviors that don't fit into the space of the absurd. And you need meaning to justify all of those. But when you strip tradition away from meaning, then you don't have that. And then leaders, everybody struggles with alignment, struggles with orientation, struggles with meaning, struggles with capital T truth. I'm going to ask you the big question right now. How do we get out of that? How do we get out of that cul-de-sac? Because I've been asking this question for the last couple of years on this podcast. How do we get out of that cul-de-sac?
Yeah, so spoiler alert, I won't have a simple, easy button answer to that, because if I had, greater minds than I would have found it already. But this notion of suicide in all of its forms, it's interesting because when you said when suicide does not take.
Yeah, when it doesn't take.
And I'm reminded of people who were interviewed who failed at their suicide attempts, jumped off a bridge, were attempted to hang themselves or what have you. And almost in every case, they say the split second after they jumped, they regretted it.
Yep.
And we cannot verify that in those who succeeded, right? One of the lines in this book that I was so struck by comes on page 121, where Camus says he's basically fascinated, my word, not his, about what Sisyphus thinks of during his descent.
Yeah. Yep.
Right after he has, for the umpteenth time, rolled that boulder up the hill, knowing that it will end the same way. What goes through his mind during the descent? And I'm fascinated by that, because I think for all of us, that is an extremely important existential question.
Yeah.
What goes through our mind during our failed attempts, right? And just a brief comment on this not even a notion, this reality of the teardown of our institutions in the West, of religion, of political parties. Please, let's not go there. Of all of these different things. And I think we stopped building. We started legislating. We started legislating religion. We started legislating what normal relationships look like. And we forgot how to be creators. And I think there's a very lengthy section of this book where Camus kind of explores what it means to be a creator versus somebody who is after conquest, and those being very different. And I don't want to jump ahead on your sort of where you want to go with this conversation, but I found that to be very interesting. And they were, in his view, at least my read of it, they were extremely different in terms of their approaches to this absurd life that we are all living in.
Almost a generation later, Camille Paglia, the art critic, and the second wave feminist art critic, who's been spewed out of second wave feminism. They don't like her anymore. But she basically, coming from her book Sexual Personae, right, which I've been sort of working my way through and trying to figure out how to bring that to the podcast readers or podcast listeners and readers. She would agree with Camus on that, and she would lay the responsibility for that legislation of reality, which is really, quite frankly, management speak for reality, at the feet of the French deconstructionists, who would righteously claim the Derridians, the Roland Barthes kind of the grandfather of them, but the Derridians, the Foucaultians, would loudly proclaim that they are the righteous disciples of Camus, and maybe a little bit of Sartre, but more like Camus, and that they were just bringing his project to its logical end. Except the problem is, when you deconstruct everything down to its smallest microbial level, or you legislate it or management speak it down to its smallest microbial level, that's not leadership. And deconstructionists, which is the moment that we are at the end of, I think, right now in the West, we're at the end. We've gotten as far as deconstruction can go. I mean, when we're at the moment of deconstructing what gender roles and gender norms that have never had to have been ever explained ever to anybody, when we're at the end of sort of opening that door, and we are at the end of it, by the way, which we're going to open up the door to transhumanism next after that, and that's going to be a whole other kettle of fish. That's going to be a fun game for everybody in the West. That's coming up next, around the corner, next 5 to 10 years. But once you deconstruct everything, then you have to start building something, right? Otherwise, and this is why, again, we explore books on this podcast. You're going to have to hit the bedrock at a certain point. And every time I ever challenge a deconstructionist or a postmodern thinker to tell me what the end game is, there is never an end game. They act as if they've never thought of the question before. And this is where then I immediately turn the corner and I go, well, then you're just Hegelian Marxists, and there's never enough revolution, and you'll just revolt until you're done. And the revolution always eats its own children. And so why are you surprised when you're eaten? But invariably, the postmodernists are always shocked. Bill Maher is surprised that people have turned on him. And I'm not blaming Bill Maher. I'm just saying, like, he's an example of a name, of someone who's surprised that, like, the entire comment section underneath, the Real Time with Bill Maher Facebook post is full of people who are like, you've abandoned us. When all he's asking about Elon Musk is, hey, should we really be worried about this, like, free speech thing? Like, that's classic liberalism. And yet he's out because revolutions always eat their own children. Mm-hmm. So, I'm in a battle against, I'm in a forward battle against deconstructionism. I'm in a forward battle against postmodernism, because I think we've reached the logical end of that nonsense, and we do have to go to building. Legislation isn't going to get us where we need to go. It isn't going to, it's not going to help us. And I love how you framed it in that sort of framing, because legalism is the last bulwark of any religion.
Well, so let me go you one better, because that image of tearing down until you get to bedrock.
Yeah.
What if there is no bedrock? What if there's nothing at the end?
What if the suicide doesn't take? Right. And exactly. And so I don't, I think there's bedrock fundamentally, but I believe that we've lost the ability, the cultural courage collectively to say that there is a bedrock there. And you saw this a lot in the writing of, but I always reference her because she was the most clear-eyed, other than maybe Hunter Thompson, was the most clear-eyed writer on this in the later part of the 20th century. Joan Didion documented all of this. And she documented it, talking about despair. She documented it from the perspective of, she particularly writes about this in Slouching Towards Bethlehem. I wrote these essays because I had the distinct impression that my writing didn't matter. And anybody who's a creative struggles with that. Engineers, doctors, lawyers, I don't think they struggle with that in the same way, because fundamentally, if you're an engineer of any stripe, if you're a doctor of any stripe, you heal somebody, you see the results. If you're an engineer, you build the bridge and it stands up. Like, you can go and walk to a place in your town or 4 towns over or whatever, where the bridge is there. But if you're in the humanities and you came out of the English literature space, I came out of the art space. If you're in any of those spaces, what you make is fundamentally ephemeral. A climate change activist can throw paint on a, and I don't even like Picasso, but can throw paint on a Picasso. By the way, they never attack the Picassos, by the way. They attack the Renoirs or the Turners. Haven't you noticed that?
I have noticed that. What is that?
Well, I think I'm going to use religious language here. I don't think devils attack themselves. I don't think they attack each other.
There you go.
I think they go for, they understand something. They understand something in a religious way, but they're not using religious language. They understand that impulse in a kind of way that the vast majority of us just go, that's insane. That's absurd. Why would you?
Well, and they're not throwing paint on Banksy because he's going to self-destruct his work anyway. So there you are.
Exactly. Yeah. So there you are. They're not creating NFTs and then like throwing paint on the NFTs, right? Like, nobody's doing that. That would be absurd. Like, if you actually went and said to them, this is the thing that you probably need to be doing. So someone can do that to your work. If you're a musician, if you're a strumming minstrel, you know, someone can record your work, slap their name on it, and call it good. If you are a writer, and this is where large language algorithms are now scaring the hell out of all the writers, but if you're a writer, there is now enough data in the world, through your voice and the voice of others, to have some enterprising 12-year-old come along and dump it into a program and prompt it to sound like you and go off and make $1 million. So art has always been ephemeral, and I think people in the arts feel this creative sense of a lack of meaning more sharply than folks do that are in maybe the harder, whatever that may mean, sciences, or the harder spaces. But I always tell the STEM people this, and then you're starting to see this happen in medical schools, most notably now, where research studies are being rejected because candidates' DE&I statements aren't robust enough. That's actually happening right now. And STEM always thought it was going to be immune to this because we're about merit, or we're about the people who just do the research. And they don't understand, I don't think, the fundamental drive underneath there. And this is what we're talking about today. And that fundamental drive comes from a sense that absurdity is what we are in. And so how do you make sense? How do you make meaning out of absurdity? What do you do if the bedrock is just absurd? And that's where I depart from Camus, because I don't think everything is absurd. It can't be. Otherwise, why are you going to making a relationship with this woman? Right. I would go to Camus directly. I'd be like, why are you making a relationship with this woman then? Like, fully follow through on your own philosophy, like walk it through to its logical end, fully live that out. But the courage to actually live that out is very difficult. And by the way, he talks about this in the book. So yeah, that's me waving the book around, folks. Back to the book. Back to The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. As usual, I do reference what edition I am reading from. Actually, Claire and I are reading both from the same edition. So reading from the Vintage International edition, a division of Penguin Random House, from Vintage Books. Myth of Sisyphus is copyright 1955 and then was renewed by Alfred A. Knopf in 1983. And so it is a great edition, actually. It's almost an art piece with the cover and everything. They did a really good job. It was printed in Italy, so I really like that. Back to the book, from The Myth of Sisyphus. All great deeds and all great thoughts have a ridiculous beginning. Great works are often born on a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving door. So it is with absurdity. The absurd world, more than others, derives its nobility from that abject birth. In certain situations, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking about may be pretense in a man. Those who are loved are well aware of this. But if that reply is sincere, if it symbolizes that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken, in which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it again, then when it is as it were the first sign of absurdity. It happens that the stage set collapses, rising streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But when one day the why arises and everything begins, that weariness tinged with amazement begins. This is important. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life, but at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. What follows is the gradual return to the chain, into the chain, or it is the definitive awakening. At the end of the awakening comes, in time, the consequence, suicide or recovery. In itself, weariness has something sickening about it. Here I must conclude that it is good, for everything begins with consciousness and nothing is worth anything except through it. There's nothing original about these remarks, but they are obvious. That is enough for a while during a sketchy reconnaissance in the origins of the absurd. Mere quote unquote anxiety, as Heidegger says, is at the source of everything. Likewise, and during every day of an unillustrious life, time carries us. But a moment always comes when we have to carry it. We live on the future, tomorrow, later on. When you have made your way, you will understand when you are old enough. Such irrelevancies are wonderful, for after all, it's a matter of dying. Yet a day comes when a man notices or says that he is 30. Thus he asserts his youth. But simultaneously, he situates himself in relation to time. He takes his place in it. He admits that he stands at a certain point on a curve that he acknowledges having to travel to its end. He belongs to time, and by the horror that seizes him, he recognizes his worst enemy. Tomorrow, he was longing for tomorrow, whereas everything in him ought to reject it. That revolt of the flesh is the absurd. A step lower, and strangeness creeps in. Perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees at this very minute, lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. For a second, we cease to understand it, because for centuries we have understood it solely in the images and designs that we had attributed to it beforehand, because henceforth we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. That stage scenery masked by habit becomes again what it is. It withdraws at a distance from us, just as there are days when under the familiar face of a woman, we see as a stranger her we had loved months or years ago. Perhaps we shall come even to desire what suddenly leaves us so alone. But the time has not come yet. Just one thing, that denseness and that strangeness of the world is the absurd. Men, too, secrete the inhuman. At certain moments of lucidity, the mechanical aspects of their gestures, their meaningless pantomime makes silly everything that surrounds them. A man is talking on the telephone behind a glass partition. You cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. This discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, this nausea, as a writer of today calls it, is also the absurd. Likewise, the stranger who at certain seconds comes to meet us in a mirror, the familiar and yet alarming brother we encounter in our own photographs, is also the absurd. Albert Camus was born in colonial French Algeria in 1913 and died in France in a car accident, a life cut short, I would assert, in 1960. He was part of the generation of people that were born just on the cusp of the horrors of World War I. Actually, he lost his father in World War I. And he wound up being part of that generation that was old enough to experience the moral and ethical disintegration in real time of Europe between the first European Armageddon moment and the second one that came in World War II. Camus was the youngest recipient at the age of 44 of the Nobel Prize in Literature for The Myth of Sisyphus in 1957. He was actually surprised that he got the Nobel Prize for Literature. He thought it would go to somebody else. Over the course of his life, he wrote several novels and philosophical essays expounding on his opposition to the existentialist theories. He wouldn't like being classified or clumped in with the existentialists, as people tend to do. And he really would not like being lumped in with Jean-Paul Sartre. But if you ever took a philosophy class in college, you know that you read Sartre and you read Camus, and then you're asked to find the difference. By the way, most of us in those philosophy classes struggle to find the difference between those two gentlemen's point of view. Camus' beliefs, because of that inability to maybe cleave and clarify on the part of critical analyzers of his work, his beliefs eventually became associated with existentialism, and they are viewed as an extension. In a lot of philosophical discourse, they are viewed as an extension of both the Nietzschean nihilistic worldview and are set often in opposition to a Kierkegaardian, as I already mentioned, worldview. And I think he's a lot closer to Kierkegaard than to Nietzsche. I think he's a lot closer to Kierkegaard than to Nietzsche, and I'll leave it at that for the moment. He did use the theories expounded in The Myth of Sisyphus to define absurdity, as we just read there, up the hierarchical chain. And I've talked about a hierarchical chain before, so let me be very clear on what I mean by this. I do believe that the fundamental nature of reality is a hierarchy, whether we like it or not. It's a hierarchy. We even classify and make patterns and rank order things. My mom used to say this very, very clearly when I was a kid. There's only one thing in a number one slot because it's number one. You try to put anything else in that number one slot, suddenly you got two things. Number one is always number one. That's why we have the number one. Either a 0 or 2 after that. Like, that's it. So we rank order things. We rank order ideas. We rank order concepts. We rank order feelings. We place things in a hierarchy. And then we expound that out into the larger world in which we live. In a family, there is a hierarchy, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. In a family, there is a hierarchy. In a community, there is a hierarchy. In the workplace, where Claire and I have made our bones, there is a hierarchy. Somebody's always at the top, or something is always at the top. And so Camus defined in that section there, absurdity up the hierarchical chain of being and thinking, because, as he states in the book a little bit later, the absurd is sin without God. By the way, sin comes from the Greek word hamartia, meaning to miss the mark, if you were an archer. However, as we already mentioned a little bit previously in our previous little jog here, one of the problems with viewing the world through an absurd lens is that when people begin to live out this type of absurdity, there's other people in the world. Other people with their hierarchies start to push on you, and they start to make demands on you. And then individual activity gives rise to leadership that leads its followers to the clearing, hopefully leads its followers to the clearing at the end of the path of absurdity. Now, I think that path is long. I think that path has been trammeled for the last 120 years, and some folks would say close to 200. And I do think we are at the clearing at the end of that path. But I think we do have to deal with this absurdity piece. And the reason why I bring up Camus' biography is because I do believe fundamentally that people are shaped by the times in which they are born. For Camus and for everyone in his generation, all the worst parts of the Bible showed up all at one time. And writing in the rubble of World War II, writing in the eclipse of the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, writing in the ambiguity of having to make a deal with gulag-based communism, which, by the way, every intellectual in Europe knew what Stalin was doing. They just didn't have the guts to call him out. Writing in the twilight of the horror of 2 nuclear weapons being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Writing at the end of all of that shapes you. It shapes how you view the world. And so when all the apocalypses show up all at one time and just continue to keep showing up, what's the appropriate response to that? And so Camus, I think, came to this theory of absurdity because of the times he was in. As we all do, by the way. So, Claire, what struck you most about Camus' approach to absurdity in the myth of Sisyphus?
One of the lines in the passage you just read that I had highlighted in my reading was this notion that the why arises and everything begins.
Yes.
Which I appreciate coming from Camus, who sort of then takes us on a journey where we should stop looking for meaning, right? Mm-hmm. But I do think, even given the time in which he was writing this, and the time through which he was living, and what framed his worldview, this is where he diverges from Sartre, his buddy and his frenemy, right? Yeah. Because Sartre, who so cleverly quipped in No Exit, hell is other people, right? Camus, despite what he lived through, despite what he observed, despite the impact of that world and those Armageddon moments that you spoke of, had on his own life and his own family, and his own experience and his own potential lifespan, he is not an isolationist.
No.
He, in fact, says, acknowledges that in our perhaps absurd quest for meaning, we are going to go out and interact with other people and therefore amplify our search for meaning, which perpetuates the absurd, okay, arguably. But he never once gets fatalistic about what other people bring to the equation and what other people bring into the conversation. And I think that is a big point of divergence from Sartre.
So that fatalism, that I would agree with you. I think Camus would say that fatalism wanders us too close to the edge of the abyss of Nietzschean nihilism, and we can't fall into that. But I think Camus was naive because, and we see it played out in our own time. So you have leaders who will use the language of postmodern discourse, but have zero clue where that language came from. They don't even know it's the language of postmodern discourse. And by the way, when you tell them that, this is one of the struggles we've had on this podcast, when you tell them that and when you point it out and when you hammer it, they just go, well, that's just the way I talk. Or they go, it doesn't mean anything, it's just words. Or even more cynically, and this is falling into the abyss then, well, I got to say what I got to say in order to convince these people and to persuade them and to move them. And I'm going to use whatever tool I've got. And it doesn't really matter what my own internal actual beliefs are. There doesn't have to be alignment there. Like, I got to make money, which is all of the worst successes of capitalist-driven materialism, which is where you get the capitalistic critique that we're all in now. But the worst successes of the capitalist-driven motives for business or for leadership. And the tragedy is, it's not just leaders in business who are using this language because they don't know where it came from. It's leaders in the capital C church. It's leaders in your civic community. It's leaders in your volunteer group. It's leaders in your mom or dad cookie patrol, right? Like the language of, there's an idea that we explored when we were reading Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway. Interesting book. I wouldn't say great, but interesting book. And well, it's interesting because what it does is it really lays bare the ways in which Virginia Woolf really sort of adopted these luxury ideas because there was no penalty to her for failing to live up to them. So she could afford to be a feminist because she didn't have to go be a washerwoman. The person who's the washerwoman in like 1923, she can't afford to be a feminist. She's got to live in the world. Now, a person with, and by the way, this is the idea of a luxury idea is not something that I came up with. That comes from Rob Henderson. But it equates to an idea that goes way far further back than this. I mean, it goes back to Plato. But it's this idea that there are certain beliefs about how the world works and the structure of reality that people who can afford to basically buy themselves out of the consequences, either materially, psychologically, emotionally, they can afford to have those ideas, but the rest of us can't. We have to operate in a different kind of way. And so this creates a two-tiered system, a two-tiered hierarchy, such as it were. That fatalism can afford to not be adopted by people with the luxury ideas of existentialism. Because it's not going to kill them one way or the other if existentialism works out or doesn't. It's not going to hurt them. They're going to buy their way out of it. But the rest of it, by the way, the person I'm thinking of right now is the person who's in like the Ivy League philosophy class, who's a trust fund kid. I may have gotten into that Ivy League school on a scholarship, but I got to go get a job. I got to hustle, kiddo. I can't afford to like be like, oh, it doesn't really matter. No, like if you're telling me that it doesn't matter, then I'm going to immediately go to fatalism. Or if you tell me that the search for absurdity is absurd in and of itself, then I'm going to get into a cul-de-sac of despair. But I still have to eat. I still have to pay my rent, right? And so it creates this cynical sort of fatalism in society and culture. And I think this is a lot of what we're battling against. One of the things that strikes me, and I'll frame this as a follow-up question, one of the things that strikes me about our culture is more and more leaders seem to be, and this is why I have my poster up here behind me from the Megamind movie. And those of you who watch this on the video, you'll see the poster. Those of you who will listen to the audio, I have the poster of the villain from Megamind, who's actually the hero in that movie, and it's the Barack Obama. It's drawn in the Barack Obama colors. And instead of it saying yes you can, underneath it says no you can't. My kids got it for me for a Christmas gift because they were like, "What do you want for Christmas?" And I was like, I was watching Megamind at the time. I love that movie, and I saw a whole series of those posters as he's like running down a street, and I paused it because my kids are always struggling for what to get me because I can buy whatever I want. I don't need anything. I'm good. I'm good on the material goods. I don't really need anything. But I paused it and I went, that would be really cool if you could find that. And they did. They went and found it. And so I have it hanging up behind me in the video. But it does. It says, no, you can't. And it's this cynical, ironic sort of push against the whole idea of hope and change, which I always thought was just a marketing ploy. But for people who have fallen into the fatalistic abyss, they needed that. And so the question is, how do we provide people hope in a world of absurdity? Because I don't think Camus can answer that question. Matter of fact, he doesn't even touch on that. He kind of dances around the edges of it, but he's not getting there. And by the way, that's part of that whole luxury belief thing. He doesn't have, because it doesn't impact him one way or the other. He doesn't have to think about it.
Well, and especially for a person as Camus who grew up through and observed world wars and Armageddon moments.
Oh yeah.
He could not, even the great Nostradamus could not have predicted the circus of world leaders we are living among as our contemporaries right now.
Oh yeah, no, please.
So and so I think, so again, you're posing another question that there is no easy answer to. And I think part of that is I'm thinking about the washerwoman versus the kept woman who can opine on feminism without consequence. That is the dividing line. We have people in leadership positions. Notice I did not say leaders. People in leadership positions who have generated literally a cult of personality around this persona that I can do anything I want, say anything I want, be anything I want, and there are no consequences. And they are setting up an expectation that if you follow me, you can live this life as well. And those of us who live in the real world and realize that there is absurdity to it all know that that is not true.
Or those of us who live in the real world and realize that there's consequences and that at a certain point there has to be an adult in the room. This is another kind of area that we've been kind of going off on the podcast lately, because I am convinced that we are really down as a culture. We're really down to, there's probably only one adult left in any given room at any given time. And by adult in the room, this has nothing to do with age, although it is very often associated with that, but it doesn't have anything to do with age. It has to do with the person who in the room says, after all of the hyperventilating and all of the emotional appeals and all the marketing is done, no, we're not doing that because it doesn't make logical sense and it doesn't match reality. And by the way, even more than the logical sense part, if we logically followed through to the cul-de-sac or the clearing at the end of the path of where your absurd hyperventilating winds us up at, we will be in chaotic destruction with even larger problems. So no, we're not doing that. You saw this in, I think most notably in culture, in the total and utter collapse of whatever the heck the Black Lives Matter movement was. Whatever the heck that was. Now, I'm not arguing or I'm not asserting that Black Lives Matter or don't matter. This is irrelevant to that. I'm not even asserting that about what we should do about statues, reparations, or any of that. That's a different thing altogether. I'm not asserting anything about race. I'm looking at the movement as a communication and leadership mode in and of itself. And that whole thing collapsed because there was one adult in the room that said, no. And by the way, it's an adult you've never heard of, who doesn't tweet. They're not on LinkedIn. You can't find them. They probably only get paid $75,000 a year. And they worked their way to the top of whatever that organization was or the movement was. And they finally looked around and said, no, we're not. We're done. Because the logical end of this is not a place where we want to go. I worry we're down to the last adult in the room, in a lot of rooms. And that really is concerning to me.
As it should be, because we are now globally flirting with fatalism.
Right.
Because how many conversations have you been in, and I've been in them numerous times, especially lately, where someone says, when will there be consequences for X person's behavior?
Right.
And I think if Camus were here in this conversation, he would say, it is your persistent waiting for that before you live the life for as many days as you have left. This is a man who died in a car accident that clearly he didn't see coming, right, a mere handful of years after he wrote this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of where because we have to get to a point where we say, I cannot shape my life, my worldview, my mentality, my search for my own meaning, whatever that looks like, and my search for my own happiness, which is elemental to me, by waiting for consequences for other people's actions and behavior. I just can't, because then I'm on the timeline, not mine.
Well, if you're waiting for consequences for other people's behavior, if you're waiting for the SEC to go get Sam Bankman-Fried, that's a luxury belief.
Right.
That's a luxury. That's not, you haven't negotiated the appropriate sacrifices with reality. You're sort of wandering into, well, you're wandering into Cain and Abel territory now, except you're Cain. You're a happy-go-lucky Cain. Don't get me wrong. You're not a murderous rage Cain, not yet anyway, but you're going to get there as you see fewer and fewer consequences coming to who you perceive as being Abel. But okay, let's just leave that aside for a minute. You're wandering into that. And you look at the story of Cain and Abel, the reason why Cain got in trouble with reality, which is framed as God in Genesis, the reason why he got in trouble, the reason why his sacrifices were rejected was because he wasn't making the appropriate sacrifices. He was waiting around for Abel to have consequences. He was waiting around for the lightning to come out of the sky and kill Abel. And it didn't.
Yeah. But this brings us back to your original question around, given all of this, this absurdity of now, this absurdity of seeming lack of consequences, and this absurd waiting for that to happen before life can begin for me, right? There has to be, and as you said, we are down to likely one adult in every room.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
It will have to come down to a couple of brave souls who take accountability. And the first couple who do and who demonstrate accountability will be sacrificed for the movement. Yeah. Right? Because it won't take one person to say, it's going to stop with me. I'm going to own this and I'm going to take whatever consequences come from that. They will not be exalted as a hero. They will be scapegoated.
Oh yeah.
But it will be the beginning of something.
So is that where hope lies? Does hope lie in the scapegoat? Because I'm about to bring up Jesus, and I mean that's the framing of Jesus. If you take away all of the theological and religious implications, I mean, that's
he took upon all the sin and all the evil onto his shoulders. Yes,
right, and he's the ultimate. Again, if you take away all the theological framing, the ultimate perfect person who is completely sinless, who never missed the mark, never committed hamartia. Right. And I do think that the transcendent spirit that is opposed to fatalism and anarchy and chaos, and there is a transcendent spirit that's fundamentally opposed to that. I, as a person coming out of a Christian worldview, I call that person God, but your mileage will probably vary. So that spirit fundamentally opposes anarchy and chaos and despair and even absurdity, because that and that spirit is the spirit that gives hope. And I'm going to frame this in cinematic terms so that people can kind of understand where I'm going at, or what I'm getting at. The movie that fundamentally lays this out is Lord of the Rings, actually, the second Lord of the Rings movie, The Two Towers, when Gandalf comes back, and he's resurrected after his battle with the Balrog. Again, a Jesus metaphor there. This is what Tolkien was getting at, right? And it's beautifully filmed in the movie. And he comes back and he was Gandalf the Grey, now he's Gandalf the White, and he steps out and all these things happen. And he says the great line, "Behold, I have returned. No, behold, I come back at the turn of the tide." Love that line, right? That's who you're talking about, right? That person is going to go fight the Balrog. That person is going to say, "No, it's me. I'm going to go do that." I think there's so many Balrogs. There's so many opportunities, and this is one of the points that we try to get across on this show. There's so many opportunities to be Gandalf. There's so many opportunities to lead the hobbits, and the hobbits are desperate. They want somebody to lead them, because I've been in those conversations too. But the hobbits aren't going to be in the office of the President of the United States. And the hobbits aren't going to be winning Grammy, or not the hobbits, the Gandalfs aren't going to be in the office of the President of the United States. Gandalfs aren't going to be winning Grammy Awards. Gandalfs aren't going to be on a Netflix show. We're looking in the wrong spots for those people. Where Gandalf is going to show up is at the Mommy and Me bake sale on Tuesday at 4:30. Sorry, that's where it's going to show up. That's where she's going to show up. Gandalf is going to show up on the manufacturing line in Alabama at Lockheed Martin at 3:00 in the afternoon when there's a problem and the whole line shuts down and now it's got to get fixed. Gandalf is going to show up in the city council meeting I'm going to name a hot button place here, the city council meeting in San Francisco, where the mayor says something stupid and the city council member goes, "Actually, that doesn't match reality." And those Gandalfs are going to show up, but behold, to paraphrase again from Lord of the Rings, the hour is late in the West.
But look, your analogy did not know you were going to go there with Lord of the Rings, so I applaud you, sir. But
I've got an encyclopedic mind.
Well, and I love it. This search for Gandalf, this invitation that you have just sort of extended to us to go find that being in
by the way, the hobbits weren't looking for. Well, the hobbits weren't looking for Gandalf. They were just living their lives eating second breakfast.
Yeah,
like they didn't expect him to show up.
But there was not one hobbit who was going to step up and say, "I shall lead. I'm going to do it." Right. But I find it interesting. You asked me, kind of how I felt about Camus' sort of definition of the absurd. And I have to tell you that even though he denies it, there is an inherent hope in his definition of absurdity, and he refutes that throughout the book. But I see this latent sense of, yes, acceptance that your life is within this container, and if you're waiting for the afterlife to give meaning and purpose to you, you've missed it. But I think there's this inherent optimism, purely because he denounces suicide as an acceptable choice if there truly is no meaning. He doesn't say, "Listen, what you need to get across, if you learn nothing else from my book, is there is no meaning in life. There's no promise of an afterlife, so you might as well just end it." He's not fatalistic. He is saying, if this is all there is, be happy anyway. Because it is not the hope of finding joy, of finding some reason, some potential that you're going to meet Gandalf, enough to keep us from taking the leap. I mean, you think of Sisyphus, what causes him, other than he is eternally damned to do this, what causes Sisyphus on the descent every single time to go back to that boulder?
But Sisyphus is a tyrant and a deceiver. He's a
He
liar
had,
from
yes,
he was a
yes.
liar from the beginning.
I mean, he's the absurd hero who has consequences.
He was,
right?
I think of Edgar's song in King Lear, which was then turned into the Robert Browning poem, The Child Roll into the Dark Tower Came. And one of the first lines in that poem, which by the way is also used as the basis for Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, which again winds up in absurdity at the end. Spoiler alert, there's 7 books. You go ahead and have a good time with that now. But but the first line in that poem, in the Robert Browning poem, is, my first thought was he lied in every word. And when I think about Sisyphus, I think about that. And the punishment for lying and deceiving is Sisyphean activity. Okay. So maybe we should do what Solzhenitsyn and even Viktor Frankl would recommend, is recognize, they would recommend 2 things. One, recognize the tyranny. And by the way, these are both guys, Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag and Frankl, who went to the concentration camps. Remarkably similar experiences, by the way. Meaningless work, right? The sign at the top of Auschwitz says Arbet macht frei, work will make you free. That's a joke at the end of your life. And not a particularly funny one either. Sisyphean labor is a punishment for lying. I think Camus misses this. What is Sisyphus thinking when the boulder rolls downhill? I hope he's thinking, not I hope, he should be thinking, wow, I probably shouldn't have lied.
Well, and so you read my mind, because I am fascinated to know what he's thinking on the descent. And I can almost guarantee, sorry, Siri, I can almost guarantee you that he's not thinking, yeah, but I deserve that. No,
he's not, because he has his pride, which is the ultimate, which is also.
So what do you think he's thinking? Because so now I'm going to be on a quest, and maybe I'll find Gandalf to help me. Yeah. What is he thinking on the descent? Because the upward climb is the same every time.
I think he's thinking the same thing that anybody who engages in Sisyphean labor thinks. I'll get it the next time.
That sounds pretty hopeful.
It does, right? Now, that again, that labor is a punishment, right? So like I said, there's what he should be thinking. He should be doing penance. And by the way, one of the interesting things about the myth of Sisyphus is that this was one of the myths that very much was challenged and rejected by theologians, interestingly enough, in the Middle Ages, in a post-Augustine, pre-Thomas Aquinas kind of era of Christianity, that interesting, like 1,000-year block that no one seems to know what to do with, where a lot of things happened and we mistakenly call it the
block out.
Yeah. We mistakenly call it the Dark Ages. It wasn't dark. The lights were on. There was nobody home. At least not in Europe anyway. No, that's terrible. There were a lot of things going on, and actually, it was socially and psychologically and socially rich time. A lot of things were happening, not just in Europe but other parts of the world. But one of the challenges of that time was, how do you fit the myth of Sisyphus into a Christian dialectic, right? And you really can't. And so the church fathers were like, no, we don't even talk about it anymore. And what's interesting is the myth of Sisyphus really came back into popularity, and began to grow in popularity as a reference to labor that was meaningless, with, of course, the Industrial Revolution. Because there's nothing more Sisyphean, at least from a cultural critic's perspective, there's nothing more Sisyphean than standing on an assembly line in Alabama, putting together a plane part. And no, I didn't say a
being
plane.
Just another cog in the wheel.
Being just another cog of the wheel, right? But the problem is, that's a luxury belief, because you go and you talk to that person in Alabama and you leave your whatever behind. You go and talk to that person, they're not getting meaning from the Sisyphean labor. They're getting meaning from their family, from their social life, from their spiritual life. They're getting meaning from all these other places. They're getting meaning from their community. They're getting meaning from their habits. They're getting meaning, from love. And so again, this is my pushback on Camus. There's all these other areas that exist that cannot be defined as absurd. They just can't. I don't define my relationship with my 6-year-old as absurd. I don't find define my relationship with my wife is absurd. If I did, my wife would probably have a problem with that. And again, this goes back to the Don Juan idea and the Don Quixote idea, that he kind of explores in there a little bit. And I do think men and women, by the way, look at this differently. I don't think that this is a shared idea. This is where you get Simone Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre kind of doing this, right? Because biology does drive some of this, and is an undeniable driver. But I think Sisyphus, I think he's thinking, yeah, I'll get it the next time. I also think, and this is something else that Camus touches on but doesn't quite fully explore, and I wish he'd done more of this, time. Time is the factor. So you mentioned that he died in a car accident. He did not. As William Shatner once sang, "We're all gonna die." We just are. His great album Has Been. He even says, one of the lines in the song is that he's reciting that by the time I hear this, I might be dead.
Well, and you mentioned Elon Musk before. He's famous for having said, it is my dream to die on Mars. I just hope it's not on impact. Right.
Right. Exactly. So that's actually kind of funny. That's actually humorous. But I think that Sisyphus doesn't have a concept that he's going to die. But he's not a god, but he's a king, so we can put whatever we want in that myth. We, however, out here in the world that we live in, we struggle because we know that our lives are going to end. I think life expectancy now in the United States for men is 70 something, 67 something, and for women it's the mid 70s or something on average, right? Obviously there are people who live longer, there are people who live shorter lives. I was recently talking with somebody who works in the long-term care and assisted living industry. Average age of a person coming into long-term care, even just 30 years ago, was 65. Average age now is 80. People are living longer, right? People are working longer. People are searching for meaning in various places longer before they finally give up. But time gets us, because we don't think, Neil deGrasse Tyson's point, we don't think astronomically or universally. We think personally and locally.
That's right.
And so I don't know that Sisyphus is thinking anything more than I'm going to grab that, because he's not grabbed by time. He doesn't know that there's no clock there wherever he's pushing the mountain. There's no clock there.
Right.
So does that give him hope? I don't know. I think it gives him persistence.
Yeah.
Hope is something else, though. So
Yeah.
anyway, we're pulling it apart. We're breaking it down. Let's go back to the book. Let's skip ahead a little bit. So let's go to some other ideas. We're going to move ahead in here. And we're going to pick up with the idea of, reason and irrationality and the monsters we create sometimes that come out of that. So back to the book, back to The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. It is futile to be amazed by the apparent paradox that leads thought to its own negation by the opposite paths of humiliated reason and triumphal reason. From the abstract god of Husserl to the dazzling god of Kierkegaard, the distance is not so great. Reason and the irrational lead to the same preaching. In truth, the way matters but little. The will to arrive suffices. By the way, that pause, that's very Nietzschean idea there. The will to power there. Careful there, Camus. Back to the book. The abstract philosopher and the religious philosopher start out from the same disorder and support each other in the same anxiety. But the essential is to explain. Nostalgia is stronger here than knowledge. It is significant that the thought of the epic is at once one of the most deeply imbued with a philosophy of the non-significance of the world and the one of the most divided in its conclusions. It is constantly oscillating between extreme rationalization of reality, which tends to break up that thought into standard reasons, and its extreme irrationalization, which tends to deify it. But this divorce is only apparent. It is a matter of reconciliation, and in both cases, the leap suffices. It is always wrongly thought that the notion of reason is a one-way notion. To tell the truth, however, rigorous it may be in its ambition, this concept is nonetheless just as unstable as the others. Reason bears a quite human aspect, but it also is able to turn toward the divine. Since Plotinus, who was the first to reconcile it with the eternal climate, has learned to turn away from the most cherished of its principles, which is contradiction, in order to integrate it into the strangest, the quite magic one of participation. It is an instrument of thought and not thought itself. Above all, a man's thought is his nostalgia. Just as reason was able to soothe the melancholy of Plotinus, it provides modern anguish the means of calming itself in the familiar setting of the eternal. The absurd mind has less luck, for the world is neither so rational nor so irrational. It is unreasonable and only that. With Husserl, the reason eventually has no limits at all. The absurd, on the contrary, established its limits since it is powerless to calm its anguish. Kierkegaard independently asserts that a single limit is enough to negate that anguish, but the absurd does not go so far. For it, that limit is directed solely at the reason's ambitions. The theme of the irrational, as it is conceived by the existentials, is reason becoming confused and escaping by negating itself. The absurd is lucid reason, noting its limits. Only at the end of this difficult path does the absurd man recognize his true motives. Upon comparing his inner exigence and what is then offered him, he suddenly feels he is going to turn away. In the universe of Husserl, the world becomes clear, and that longing for familiarity that man's heart harbors becomes useless. In Kierkegaard's apocalypse, that desire for clarity must be given up if one wants to be satisfied. Sin is not so much knowing, if it were, everybody would be innocent, as wanting to know. Indeed, it is only the sin of which the absurd man can feel that it constitutes both his guilt and his innocence. He has offered a solution in which all the past contradictions have become merely polemical games. But this is not the way he experienced them. Their truth must be preserved, which consists in not being satisfied. He does not want preaching. By reason, he wants to be faithful to the evidence that aroused it. That evidence is the absurd. It is that divorce between the mind that desires and the world that disappoints. My nostalgia for unity, this fragmented universe, and the contradiction that binds them together. Kierkegaard suppresses my nostalgia, and Husserl gathers together that universe. That is not what I was expecting. It was a matter of living and thinking with those dislocations, of knowing whether one had to accept or refuse. There can be no question of masking the evidence, of suppressing the absurd by denying one of the terms of its equation. It is essential to know whether one can live with it or whether, on the other hand, logic commands one to die of it. I am not interested in philosophical suicide, but rather plain suicide. I merely wish to purge it of its emotional content and know its logic and its integrity. Okay. At this moment, I think of mystical poet. Now bought poetry twice on the podcast. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Pretty good record. Usually it's only once. But I think of a mystical poet from the late 19th century, a guy you would know, a guy named Edgar Allan Poe. And by the way, we're going to have a link to a version of Edgar Allan Poe's poem here, which I'm about to quote from The Raven, from that great absurd show. It was on in the late 90s that I used to watch, and it came on just before Batman, the animated series. And then my grandma would kick us off the television and watch Oprah. But Tiny Toon Adventures, I loved that show. So I'm gonna clip, or not put clip, but I'm gonna put the clip of the video version of this poem in the show notes here. But the poem is Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And I quote from The Raven: "Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obseance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad face fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the Raven, "Nevermore." Ravens are carrion birds, just like eagles. Sisyphus irritated the gods because he was a liar and a cheat. Camus lived in the wreckage of a European experiment that didn't quite work out. And by the way, everybody was clamoring for wreckage starting in the 1840s. Everybody wanted the European experiment, at least the intellectuals wanted the European experiment to go away, and thought that it would be glorious to have a world war. Huh. By the way, they actually wrote that down. If you go back and read the European intellectuals from like 1840 to 1840 is a little early, 1850 to 1914. And then they all went and died in the trenches in World War I. Not to be ironic, and I'm not being funny here, that's what happened to them. Camus grew up in all of that. And he grew up at a time when there were monsters with carrion birds perched on their shoulders everywhere. And Camus' solution was to mock the monsters and declare freedom from them. But the leaders and followers that always show up, because here's the problem: the apocalypse is always happening, and then there's always people afterward. They're always rebuilding, and the leaders and the followers that showed up to rebuild the ruined European capitals, well, there was no transcendent moment, right? There was just rebuilding. Jesus did not return. And to make matters even worse for Camus and folks of his thought process, his ilk, his decorum, such as it were, his countenance, the United States came to social political dominance, much to everybody's chagrin in Europe. And at that point, I guess from Camus' perspective, living in absurdity looked like a distinctly European solution to the distinctly European problem of a lack of identifiable sources of meaning. Since, of course, Nietzsche declared God dead, because what were you going to do? But there hasn't been an apocalyptic world war for about 80 years in the West. The West has not gone to war with itself in 80 years. I'm firmly convinced that that's a streak we should probably keep going. And we've got postmodernism, and we already mentioned this on the podcast, that seeks to fill the vacuum created by a lack of meaning. That starts with deconstructionism, but then turns to cynical capitalism, turns to market solutions, and now has turned to ideologies and isms to fill that vacuum, fill that void. Einstein was correct. Yeah, Einstein. Einstein well, Einstein was correct. I'll grant him to that, or give it to him. I'll give him the credit. He was correct in that nature abhors a vacuum. Even the nature inside of us abhors a vacuum, and the vacuum of meaning had to be filled by something, but those things didn't fill the vacuum, and so we can't deconstruct the lack of meaning itself. Or we could, but then we wind up with carrion birds, maybe not on our shoulders, but on our windowsills, squawking at us nevermore. And we don't really know how to deal with that. Claire brought up cult of personality, and I didn't really jump on that. Kind of let that go, but I think we have a cult of personality combined with a cult of youth, because youth has promise and youth has hope, because time defeats us, right? But the problem with the cult of youth, and we already mentioned this in a shorts episode, gosh, I think episode number 83 or might have been 79. It's one of those. Go back and listen to all the shorts episodes. They're really good listening. There's only 6 to 8 minutes. It's not that long of your time. But those cults of youth, those cults of personality, and the cult of personality, by the way, was brought to us by Steve Jobs. Many of you are listening to me on Apple devices. The cult of personality was brought to you by Steve Jobs. He was the first one to really push that up the hierarchy past where it probably should have been. That cult of youth, that cult of personality, has created leaders who lack meaning. And I'm not talking about from a particular age perspective. I'm talking about from a meaning perspective. And so how do we solve the meaning crisis, Claire? How do we've been dancing around it and kind of exploring it a little bit with fatalism, or where do you find hope in absurdity? I'm just going to go right to it. How do we solve the meaning crisis in our time? What's the answer? And yes, I know. There's a lot of people working on it. And maybe it's not one answer. Maybe it's an aggregate of a collection of answers. But we seem to be resistant to going back to tradition, except for in certain quarters where they're fine with that. But how do we restore meaning? How do we do that for folks? How do leaders do that? Because meaning isn't going to be in a cult, whether it's a personality or youth. Cults are always a bad thing, by the way. Kids, don't get involved with cults. And suicide is not a problem, or not a solution, because you can have societal suicide. And there are some who have claimed that the West, particularly this is critiques coming from the East, there are some who claim that the West is, in essence, committing cultural and societal suicide right now in real time. That is an absolute critique that comes from the East, and not just from Vladimir Putin. It comes from a lot of other people. And it's been coming for a long time, by the way. So the only solution to that that I can think of is, how do we find meaning? How do we do that?
We are never as immortal as when we are young, right? And we are never, I think, as absurd as we are in our youth, because for the sheer fact that we think we will never die.
Right.
So just to sort of play off of what you just said, we were talking earlier about this persistent need we have to see others have consequences for their monstrous behavior, right? Mm-hmm. And as you said, Camus' solution was to mock the monsters. I don't think that's the solution for us. I think there are enough people demonstrating monstrous behavior who mock their counterparts, and I don't think we have to follow suit. I think that is part of how we got here. But here is our opportunity, right, to break free from that need to see other people experience consequences before we feel like, okay, finally, there's meaning and purpose to this life. And the passage you shared from Camus just a moment or two ago, there is this this sort of recommendation from Camus to purge situations from its emotional content.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think for him, the reward of consciousness, the reward for consciousness of the absurd, right, where everything begins, is not merely lucidity. It's this wonderful notion that he says a couple of times of lucid indifference. And I think that is the pursuit. When we purge things of their emotional content, these monsters of our own making, these cults of personality that we see on a 24/7 news cycle, that we then internalize and they become ulcerous, constant presence in our own psyche. And we finally say, we're going to turn that off. We're going to tune that out. We're going to make decisions for ourselves. And we are not going to have emotional attachment to what they do or what they don't get called out upon in our own pursuit of meaning. And I think when we can do that individually, there is this enormous freedom that can happen by striving for and achieving that lucid indifference. And it's not a lack of caring, right? It is not because there is this fine line, and that's when we flirt with the fatalism to say, well, I'm just not going to care about anything. Great, problem solved. Well, no, that's why you then go seek the highest bridge to jump from.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a difference between lucid indifference, this conscious choice to separate what you do or don't do from my emotional attachment and my measurement of my own worth. And being able to do that in a way that does not make you give up.
Do you think we're attempting to do this? And it's interesting. So one of the guests that I've had on my show within the last year and a half, I won't say his name because there's just no need to do that. He has done some experimental work in the space of psychedelics. And there is a growing interest in psychedelics as a way to open the door to this lucid indifference, sort of the tune in, turn on, drop out of the baby boomer generation, specifically the Timothy Leary branch of the baby boomer generation. But version 3.0, not even 2.0. We had version 2.0 in the early 90s. I was around for a lot of that. Now we're into version 3.0 of that, right? And I wonder if we pursue the chemicalization of it, because that lucid indifference is really hard to get without chemicals. On the opposite end of that, and we talk a lot about that on this show, we have large language algorithms, which we've already mentioned this, which are going to be, if we keep going down a particular road, which we seem to be insistent on going down, they are going to be monsters that we will struggle to drain emotional content from. And our monsters will eat us. This is what Sam Altman of the OpenAI project is worried about. As smart as he is, at the end of the day, he's describing to an 80-year-old senator who barely uses the internet because he doesn't need to, quite frankly. He just doesn't need to. He's explaining to an 80-year-old senator that he needs to be stopped from doing something that he should be smart enough to stop doing himself. He's explaining to the senator that he doesn't seem to be able to stop himself from creating a monster, that he is imbued with emotional content. And this is part of my problem with the framing of all of the talk on artificial intelligence on the one end of the spectrum, and then the framing of LSD and psychedelics on the other end of the spectrum. These two things are linked, weirdly enough. And they're linked in this space of, as you mentioned, emotional content. we're giving these tools emotional content. So I do some carpentry here and there. No, I can't come to your house and build a cabinet. Don't ask me. And even if I could, I wouldn't anyway. But I don't imbue my hammer with emotional content. If I hit myself with the hammer, I have emotional content about that. I may throw the hammer, I may put the hammer down, I may decide I'm not going to use that hammer anymore, but I'm not demanding that hammer get up and walk around to fulfill my material needs. We're doing that in a lot of ways with our tools, and that's my primary concern, because we seem to have drained meaning from all these other spots, but the things that are material, we can imbue those with meaning. And by the way, the version 1.0 of this is our cell phones in our pockets. You know, we're not going to need pagan temples on street corners like the Greeks and the Romans had to every freaking, like Augustine talks about, to every freaking god on the face of the planet. We got a temple for everything. I mean, even the Apostle Paul talked about that. You know, like we got pagan temples everywhere. You have a pagan temple in your pocket. The temple to Instagram, the temple to Facebook, the temple to LinkedIn, the temple to your email, the temple to whatever it is you're doom scrolling. That's a temple. People are already anthropomorphizing that. They're already giving emotional content to that. So you mentioned purging the monsters of emotional content. How do we do that? How do we do that and put meaning back in the spot where it needs to be, and put those monsters or those tools back in the place where they need to be?
Well, this comes back to cults of personality, right? There is this almost mob mentality around following the loudest, most boisterous, most outlandish, unfiltered voice in the room. And I think,
look at all this passion.
I mean, right. I think people not only at their core want to believe in something bigger than themselves, right? I do think there is this innate quest for meaning. But I think part of the they're not joining these cults for meaning. It's for that other hunger and thirst that they have, which is to belong. And I think that's the part where the cults have gained so much ground. I mean, we can look historically. This is not new. Cults of personality. You mentioned Hitler. Talk about Hitler and the cult of personality, how he got legions of people to follow his vision, right?
Hitler's easy. Let's talk about Stalin.
Right.
There are people there. If you poll Russians today, something like 60-70% of them, saw the statistic last year on the cusp of the Ukraine war, 60-70% of them are like, yeah, Stalin was fine. Now you could argue those are people who never lived under communism. Most of them
true, and you will find the same proportion of people who think Mussolini was fine,
right? Or Pol Pot,
right?
What's his name? Gaddafi. There we go.
Yeah.
Gaddafi in Libya, like
right.
Any of the right.
Yep.
So there's the strong man leader, right?
Yes.
It's easy to pick on Hitler because
sure,
but like everybody kicks Hitler.
It's I mean, he's an easy target, right? You would think, although there's a component of society who thinks he was a genius. So
we'll leave those folks over there.
Right. They're not hopefully watching your, they don't have the intellectual fortitude to watch your podcast. So we don't have to worry about that.
No, but so, okay. So those cults, right? Or even, I mean, and it's easy to pick on Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, whoever. Those are big nation state names. Let's talk about the vice president who arrives to the office on Monday incredibly intoxicated, but we won't fire him because he closed his sales. I've run into that guy before, and I've said to the organization or to the culture, oh yeah, you can solve this problem easily, just fire the guy. But he makes his numbers, or he does this, or he does that. Well, then I guess you don't really want to solve the problem, so make sure my check is in the mail.
Well, is it at all a coincidence that the root of the word culture is cult? Coincidence? Don't think so.
It turns out it turns out that some transcendental entity out there has a sense of humor.
They're chuckling right now, going, you got it.
There it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Well, and it's, I mean, you relate to this because this is core to the work that you do as well. When you're working with leaders and you are striving to help them to become more followable, because it is only through that you achieve a shared mission and all of these things. The culture is core to that. Put cult aside for a second. Culture is foundational to an organization's success, right? In any of its forms. It is also the root of its undoing if a culture is fractured, is toxic, is all of these things. And the biggest impact on a culture, hands down, is the behavior of its leaders. It's not, well, our culture bubbles up organically from the boots on the ground. No, it doesn't. Your people are watching. They are following your lead, good or bad. They are seeing what gets rewarded. They are seeing what type of leader gets elevated to the corner office with the nice, all the trappings, right? The comfy chair, the really nice car, the multiple vacation homes, the life. And so leaders have a choice. They can either get enamored by that and get swept into that, their own cult of personality, or they can much more intentionally look for that meaning and what they are trying to build, right? We were talking earlier about this sort of this exploration of these two personas that Camus explores, the creator and the conqueror. And up until about 20 years ago, the conqueror was the CEO archetype, right? Command and control, just do as I say, not as I do. And fortunately, that style is dying off. I don't mean anyone ill will, but they're phasing out of the executive wing. So we are now at a point where they can either be creators, potentially, or they can at least be catalysts for something that is cohesive, not toxic. That, as you said earlier, sort of eats its own, it destroys itself from the inside. And that really is a lot of the core of modern leadership is, how do you, to me, the antidote for the cult is community. And how do we create a culture in an organization that fosters and nurtures communities of people finding meaning not only in their own work, but in collaborating across the aisle with colleagues to achieve something bigger than themselves?
Okay. And I don't disagree with any of that. And that's very Gandalf-like behavior.
See, some Gandalfs live in Long Branch.
There you go. That's right. I'll have the long bottom leaf she's having. The other challenge that doesn't get talked about is, and Camus was writing, and honestly, he would have, I think he talks a little bit about this in The Rebel, but anyway, if I remember correctly, but he's existing in a space, and he's writing in a space of the beginning of the 20-year-long process. And I didn't mention the United States by accident in there. The 20-year-long process of the United States becoming a dominant manufacturing, forget all the other different ways, but a dominant manufacturing power in the world, right? Now, typically what happens, the Roman Empire, again, is easy to kick, so we're not going to kick the Roman Empire. Let's go to the Chinese. Let's kick China a little bit. So when China was a dominant power in trading, running the Silk Road and all those other kinds of things that the Chinese Communist Party now references as a time of Chinese glory, right? Before the West came in and robbed them of their glory. They demanded basically the word that Edgar Allan Poe uses, or that quote from the Raven, or that piece from the Raven, demanded obedience, right? Demanded service, right? Most colonial empires demand obsequiousness from the colonized, right? And without exception, well, no, with very few exceptions, Hawaii being an exception, the Philippines probably being another exception. Cuba was kind of on the bubble, and then they kind of went in a different direction. The United States has very rarely demanded worship. What the United States demands is you sell us stuff. That was what came out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was at the end of World War II. We will open our ports. We have the largest consumer market. You're not making any money. Would you like to sell something to somebody? Because we got a lot of people. We got no damaged cities. Y'all want to make money together or what? And by the way, we'll double down and we'll give a security guarantee to you. So when you're shipping your crap, and a lot of it was crap, but when you're shipping your crap to our ports, we'll make sure pirates don't steal your stuff. Because that was a real problem. People don't think of piracy in that kind of way anymore, because after 80 years of all of that going on, piracy, I'm not going to say piracy has gone away. There was a recent incident between the Iranians and the Chinese and the Turks, but I won't get into all that. But like, you know, piracy isn't what it was in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. When the British were like, please, they were trying to clean up the high seas. The United States basically came along and said, we will build a fleet. It will have destroyers in it. And if there's ever any problem, we'll just show up in your harbor, we'll point a gun at you, and everything will be fine. And everybody at the table, including most of the European powers, were shocked by this. Fundamentally, what that did was it shifted European political thought and European leadership thought on how leadership could be done. And they shifted from, we are the giants, and we're going to tell the United States what to do, to where we are now, which is we're Lilliputians, and maybe we're just going to try to tie like one little corner of the like foot down here because like whatever. Okay, the reason why I bring that up is because in leading people, the thing we don't talk about is the knock-on effects from the Industrial Revolution as they filtered down into leadership. We seem to be unable to wrap our arms around this. And you referenced it a little bit with command and control. I would assert that command and control began to end in the 1970s. But we didn't really fully see the fruition of it, because there were people talking about the end of command and control in the 1990s. There were people talking about the end of the command and control in the 1980s, particularly as more women came into the workforce and more women came into leadership positions. So this process has been going on for a while, as it usually does at the nation state level. But the knock-on effect of the Industrial Revolution hasn't really fully been dealt with, primarily by people like you and I, quite frankly. Like, we don't really talk too much about that. But the people that we're talking to, even the people in their 30s that we're talking to, they still have all the detritus. They still have all of the rubble from those Industrial Revolution assumptions in their heads. How do we get rid of that? How do we go, no, you know what? We're now, Timothy Berners-Lee turned on the commercial internet in 1989. We're damn near 50 years into the internet. Like, but I look around and what do I see in my material world? I see streets and bridges that have been updated since the 1950s because they over-engineered them, and they just like the bridge that just fell recently in Philadelphia. I mean, it fell not because of poor engineering. It fell because, well, like, they over-engineered it, and like it lasted 80 years. Like I was in Minneapolis when the bridge collapsed. In Minneapolis, like, the bridge collapsed in Minneapolis, not because of bad modern engineering, but because they over-engineered it and it was just at the end of its life. Like, right. It was just done. Like, the things we over-engineered 80 years ago are now done. But they're still here.
I mean, should we talk about the World Trade Center? And it was designed to withstand the impact of a plane, but they had not envisioned the massive size of a jet airliner and all the fuel that it could carry when they built it. So
yeah, there you go. So how do we balance those two contradictions? How do we lead through those contradictions? This is one of the things that I was struggling with figuring out with leaders for at least the last decade, because the detritus of the Industrial Revolution is more than just physical. It's also economic, it's also social, it's also material, it's also psychological, and those areas impact leaders. There's a training that I do called Adapting to Change. And before, interestingly enough, before COVID, almost nobody gave me high ratings on adapting to change. Almost invariably, every group hates that one before COVID. All of them. Oh God, they want to fight me. I don't know what I'm talking about with change. I don't know what I'm talking about with change management. How dare you bring VUCA to us? What does this mean? Everything's fine. Nothing's ever going to change. I've done it a couple times post-COVID. It's interesting how everything has shifted around. Now everybody's real quiet and pays real close attention and takes good notes. I don't like it that it seems to be, the dynamic seems to be, you got to take trauma, right? And you got to take a knock to sort of move you away from your preconceived notions of leadership. But I don't know how many knocks an organization or a nation state or a culture can take before it finally goes, you know what, we're knocked out. I don't want to know. I don't want to know when I don't want to experience that, right? And so part of my mission is to have leaders, engage with clearing out the debris from the Industrial Revolution. But how do we convince them? How do I convince them? How do we convince them that this debris actually exists? Because maybe that convincing process is absurd even in and of itself.
Well, I think the inherent resistance to change, of course, is part of human nature, but it is the biggest thing that executive leaders, in particular, human resources leaders, but all leaders really, it's what keeps them up at night. It's, and I see this in large organizations. I see this in startup companies that are trying to grow. I see this in strategic acquirers who are amassing sort of a portfolio of companies. They all come up against the same thing, and they are all equally surprised that when they bring in their vision for the future and their vision for growth, that people resist it, because they may get on board with you conceptually until the very first thing you ask them to do that's different from what they've always done, even though they're not really enamored with the way things are, because it's familiar. There's a reason there's a phrase, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Yep.
Right. I see this, especially you talk about this debris, this debris field that we are still living and working within. It is, I have seen it most keenly felt in a post-merger environment, because now you are bringing together two organizations, two entities, but really two cultures that haven't figured out what to do with the clutter in their own closet, the debris field in their own organization. And now they're going to combine forces and think that that is going to spackle over all of the rough edges. And they are shocked to see that clash, when you bring together the entities, prohibits them from moving forward. It's the reason up to 90% of these mergers and acquisitions fail. If not bring the business under, they at least underperform in massive ways. And I think, to your point, part of that reason is because we are not, as humans and as organizations, and it only gets worse the more of us we pull together into a room, we are not good at being radically honest about our current state. Our emperors walk around with no clothes on, and we go, yeah, but at least we know who he is. We're not radically honest. And again, I think part of what has made it nearly impossible to be radically honest is, again, we're waiting for the one guy or gal to take those front bullets so that we can then charge in and recreate a culture of accountability. Because the first couple of people who do it are going to fall on the sword. And nobody wants to be that guy or gal.
There's another thing that occurs to me, but I'm going to hold on. I'm going to hold on to it. There's something There's another thing that occurs to me.
See, now I'm older than you. If I don't remember to say it right when it occurs to me, if you don't write it down, but I saw you grab the book again, so I think we're gonna have another reading. So go.
We're gonna go back to the book. Yeah, I'm gonna hold
Love
on
it.
to something there because there's
All right,
something
that's
in there.
cool.
I'm gonna cogitate on something. I think it relates to the next thing that's coming up. Actually, that's why I'm gonna hold on to it. So back to the book. Back to Myth of Sisyphus. I'm gonna read a couple of pages here. We're gonna skip ahead a couple of pages and pick up where he says this. Indeed, he does not want to do anything but what he fully understands. He's talking about the person who is living in absurdity. He is assured that this is the sin of pride, but he does not understand the notion of sin, that perhaps hell is in store, but he has not enough imagination to visualize that strange future, that he is losing immortal life, but that seems to him an idle consideration. An attempt is made to get him to admit his guilt. He feels innocent. To tell the truth, that is all he feels, his irreparable innocence. This is what allows him everything. Hence, what he demands of himself is to live solely with what he knows, to accommodate himself to what is, and to bring in nothing that is not certain. He is told that nothing is, but this is at least a certainty. And it is with this that he is concerned. He wants to find out if it is possible to live without appeal. Now I can broach the notion of suicide. It has already been felt what solution might be given. At this point, the problem is reversed. It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living an experience, a particular fate, is accepting it fully. Now, no one will live with this fate, knowing it to be absurd, unless he does everything to keep before him that absurd brought to light by consciousness. Negating one of the terms of the opposition on which he lives amounts to escaping it. To abolish conscious revolt is to elude the problem. The theme of permanent revolution is thus carried into individual experience. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, contemplating it. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. It is an insistence upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second. Just as danger provided man the unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. It is that constant presence of man in his own eyes. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. This is where it is seen to what degree absurd experience is remote from suicide. It may be thought that suicide follows revolt, but wrongly, for it does not represent the logical outcome of revolt. It is just the contrary by the consent it presupposes. Suicide, like the leap, is acceptance at its extreme. Everything is over and man returns to his essential history. His future, his unique and dreadful future, he sees and rushes toward it. In this way, it is in this way that suicide settles the absurd and engulfs the absurd to the same death. But I know that in order to keep alive, the absurd cannot be settled. It escapes suicide to the extent that it is simultaneously awareness and rejection of death. It is, at the extreme limit of the condemned man's last thought, that shoelace that, despite everything he sees a few yards away, on the very brink of his dizzying fall. The contrary of suicide, in fact, is the man condemned to death. That revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. To a man devoid of blinders, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grips with a reality that transcends it. The sight of human pride is unequaled. No disparagement is of any use. That discipline that the mind imposes on itself that will conjure it up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle, have something exceptional about them. To impoverish that reality whose inhumanity constitutes man's majesty is tantamount to impoverishing him himself. I understand then why the doctrines that explain everything to me also debilitate me at the same time. They relieve me of the weight of my own life, and yet I must carry it all alone. At this juncture, I cannot conceive that a skeptical metaphysics can be joined to an ethics of renunciation. Consciousness and revolt, these rejections are the contrary of renunciation. Everything that is indomitable and passionate, a human heart quickens them, on the contrary, with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is a repudiation. The absurd man can only drain everything to a bitter end and then deplete himself. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary effort, for he knows that in that consciousness and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof only of his only truth, which is defiance. This is a first consequence. The problem of other people. When you are around other people, they push on you and they pull on you and they demand things of you. I don't know if Claire's got any kids, but I got 4 of them, and the demands are never ending. The requests are an infinity. For desire and hunger is an infinity. There's never enough, right? And the challenge of parenting is putting parameters and boundaries on these little people, that if you just let them keep going, it's just going to be boundless, right? Because, as I said to one of my children recently, the world spreads out before you. Actually, I was talking about his summer. Actually, it's like the summer spreads out before you like a field of yellow wheat. I have to go to work. Other people are going to push on your absurd philosophy or your philosophy of absurdity. They're going to push on that, and they're going to make demands of you, right? And the problem is, the more demands that are made upon you that push upon that philosophy, the smaller it becomes. This is my struggle with absurdicism, or whatever it is that Camus would call it. The other problem is that the smaller your philosophy of meaning is, let's say meaning from absurdity, the more easily it's deconstructed. And the more easily it's deconstructed, the less easily it can recognize and can counter evil, and the more easily it collapses in the face of genuine evil. This is a problem with constantly referencing Hitler or Stalin or whoever, right? It's almost as if we're referencing previous evil because no ultimate evil has shown up in our own time, except Camus lived and wrote in a time where the evil actually showed up. We live and work in a time where, well, I'll name a name, where Klaus Schwab looks like he came out of central casting from Austin Powers' Goldmember. Nobody's taking any of the people at the running the World Economic Forum seriously, but they don't know that. They think they are being taken seriously. And unfortunately, they are being taken seriously by some people, but not the hobbits. What does genuine evil look like? How do you have a robust enough philosophy to counter the genuine evil of other people? Just like Nietzsche before him, Camus never took his philosophy to its logical end, which serves as a warning to leaders living, working, and leading in a world where other people still believe in things that push on the absurd, like competency or merit or consequences, and people who would also very much like an answer, and a clear answer to the problem of evil. This is what upended the new atheists, Dawkins, Hitchens, and Sam Harris back in the early 2000s, if you remember those folks. What upended them was shut all of their mouths, including Dawkins, by the way, was the problem that the atheist moralists like Camus, or the scientific rationalist atheists like Richard Dawkins, still can't wrap their arms around, which is the problem of, well, it's the problem of, why does a person beat a child instead of hug it? Or why does someone decide that they're going to assault somebody else on a subway? Or why does a person who should love their wife or husband instead hit them or steal from them? Or why does somebody who should be watching out for a vulnerable person take from them instead of give to them? There's no answers to these things. And relativism is a thin philosophy, because what it means fundamentally at the end of the day is, well, I should just take from you because everything is open to me, because that's my ethic. You need a larger philosophy. You need a bigger idea. And atheistic moralism isn't going to be the answer that Camus recommended, or at least tried to live. And the challenge or the critique of the Christian worldview, and why it still persists, by the way, is that it is big enough to answer that question, or at the very minimum, to backstop against it. The question of evil. So we're hitting big questions here on this podcast today with Claire. So Claire, the question of evil: how could leaders identify, counter, and lead people through evil, if not even evil times? Or let's say the times aren't evil. Let's say that everything is getting better. There was recently a study that was released that said we're actually not in a moral decline. Every generation thinks it's in a moral decline going back 70 years. We're not really in a moral decline. It's proximity bias and a bunch of nonsense and stories that we have in our heads. And if we were more scientific and rational about this, we'd realize that everything is getting better, a la Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now. And let's all just shut up about this whole moral decline thing, because there is no evil that doesn't exist, just like there is no good. There's just stuff. By the way, that was the underlying current of that study, but it's fine. We can't, and the other underlying current of it was we can't make any judgments about meaning or give you any direction of where to go. We can just give you data. Well, data doesn't give you meaning. It's just data at the end of the day. And so how do leaders lead through times that, okay, maybe they're not at a data level evil, but the zeitgeist, and you are out there, I'm out there, we feel things in the zeitgeist. Those can't be ignored. They can't be quantified maybe as numbers on a page, but they can't be ignored either. So how do leaders lead people through these, what some would call evil times?
So there is this gentleman named Robert Hartman. You may have heard of Robert S. Hartman. He fled Nazi Germany, not to bring Hitler back up, but Hartman kind of devoted his earlier life while in Nazi Germany to mocking the monster that was Hitler. Mm-hmm. He would publish underground, diatribes against Hitler. Sort of the precursor to Photoshop. He would put up mock photos of Hitler wearing a dress, and he had all of these pamphlets about how Hitler was a cross-dresser and he was really, effeminate and all of these sorts of things, right? Mm-hmm. And inexplicably, that kind of put a target on him, and people wanted him dead. So he fled, and he spent the rest of his life in the United States, and he devoted his life to this sort of quest for meaning around, if people could unite around an axiom of evil, could they not unite around an axiom of good? And he's universally sort of regarded as the father of axiology. He sort of devoted his life to this. He compiled this Hartman value profile or inventory or index. And so I think he had come the closest, and some of his profiling came the closest to arriving at a data set around, what is the composite of an evil profile versus one that is oriented toward good. But again, we can't be reduced to ones and zeros. Obviously, we can try. Maybe that would bring us a little bit more of that lucid indifference. That would be wonderful. But I think what he finally arrived at was something that we talked about earlier in terms of this concept of leadership of self, which is the truly great leaders, the truly good, great leaders have this self-awareness of what is good about them from a pure attribute perspective, not from a self-aggrandizement of, I am good enough, I am smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me, right? But what truly are their natural strengths and what truly motivates them, so that once aware of this, they can be authentic to who they truly are. And so this comes back to that almost moral imperative, but certainly a leadership imperative for leaders to be very reflective and then very authentic to the style that is truly genuine and natural to them, because we all want to follow people that not necessarily look and act and talk and believe the way that we do, but are innately followable. And that starts with recognizing in them first their humanity. Not that they are perfect, not that they are flawless, not that they are charismatic speakers, but that they are human. And I think that's where ultimately some of these cults of personality eventually fold in upon themselves because people finally discover that these people are not gods. They are not perfect, and they are not without consequence. At least that is our hope, right? So I think for modern leaders, part of the way that they counter evil is to deeply understand what it is they are trying to create and trying to catalyze within their organization. And the good ones, not the ones who are using their powers for evil, but the good ones, I think, are about building communities of talent, for lack of a better word. And I know that's sort of a managerial word, but I think a lot of organizations are starting to appreciate how to, really why they should pull together communities of talent toward achieving common ends. They don't all know how to do it yet, but I think they are getting around to the insight that if we can tap into collective talent in ways that are collaborative and sort of forward leaning, we don't have to act so hierarchical. We don't have to be so command and control. We can finally sweep away the debris of the industrial age and create a different reality. And that is extremely grandiose. But I think it has to start with a grander vision than we think we can reach.
Yeah, or else what's a heaven for, right? I mean, like,
exactly,
what are we,
exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. Communities of talent to achieve a common end. I like that. And what do we do with the spirit that brings in narcissism and trolls? Because right now, the thing that is happening, there's two parallel tracks that are running, right? So there's a track in what I call the real world, where you build with real people to solve material problems that are hard. And so those material problems might be, I don't know how to build a cabinet for my house, right? Or I don't know how to plumb, right? Or I don't know how to sell my house, right? Or my community has a need for XYZ thing, and I need to get a bunch of people together in order to do that. We have to fight the regulatory red tape, and we're going to build, mixed use retail, or we're going to build whatever we're going to build, right? That stuff is still happening pretty much the same way that it has always happened in the world. But then you have this other parallel track that's running right by it. And it's the parallel track of the things that are happening on the internet. And those two tracks very rarely intersect. And so you'll have a person who is trying to sell their grandma's heirlooms in an estate sale because grandma can't do it because she's 91. And they need a little help pricing these items. And you go into them, actually this happened to me recently, you go into them and you say, well, these items need to be this way. And you pull up the internet on your phone and you show them items that have gotten similar prices on the internet. And they go, I never knew that. And you ask them what they do, and everything they talk about in their lives is on that other parallel track that's not on the internet. We saw a lot of this with COVID. A lot of this with COVID. There are two parallel tracks running. And in that parallel track that's on the internet, there are trolls. There's a dark triad. I mean, you're in leadership development. You've heard all about the dark triad, right? There are malignant narcissists. There are anonymous hybrid, algorithm human hackers. There's all this stuff happening. And there are still good people in the world. In that other track, when I talk about how do we deal with evil in the world, I'm probably thinking of the internet track, but we are starting to see some of those folks with that second track begin to bleed out into the first track, right? How do leaders deal with that? Because you're building a community of talent to achieve a common end. And you've got, I don't know, 30 people, right? But all 30 of those people all have Apple iPhones in their pockets, and they're living a life on that second track that you don't know anything about. And at a certain point, someone's going to come to you and someone's going to say, we should take a posture on XYZ ideology du jour of the day. And you're going to be like, I never heard of that before. And they're going to whip out whatever community they've got that's parallel in their phone. And they're going to say, well, everybody's talking about it. And they're going to show you a tweet that's got 4,000 likes. Or they're going to show you a blog post that got 3,500 reshares. Or they're going to show you a social media post or a YouTube video that got, 400,000 views. And now if you're on that first track, that real world track, the courage comes in going, I don't know any of those people, and that's not what we're doing here. It doesn't matter. That's where the courage comes. The problem is that person is living on the second track. They're not living on the first track with you, or it's a foreign country that they only visit between 9 and 5. And then then all the rest of the time, they're on that other track. They're building a whole thing over there. How do we as leaders recognize the two-track problem?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that there is a two-track problem. You and I kind of talked about this in our previous conversation, sort of setting up this one, that we've gotten away from discourse, from having conversations where I think the society at large has forgotten how to think for itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think of a more, polite way to say it, but I think flat out, people have forgotten how to think for themselves, and they have convinced themselves that with the rise of not only the internet, but the accessibility to information, good, bad, wrong, or right, and now with AI that can take the entire inventory of the internet, good, bad, right, or wrong, and spit out an answer for you. And because it's in a cohesive sentence, convince you that that is something you should repeat. We have so much permission to be lazy and not think for ourselves. We have a 24/7 news cycle that, rather than reading the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, or I hesitate to name publications because it might offend somebody in this polarized society. Rather than do that, it is far easier to watch the first half hour, the A block of whatever slanted news media channel we're tuned into.
Well, and
what has that gotten us?
Well, and we cry out, and then the solution for this, we cry out for gatekeepers.
Yes.
But the problem is those gatekeepers are ideologically living on that same two-track system. They're not any better. No. So the BBC is going to, they've already said that they're going to do what is it? And the only reason I'm naming them publicly is because they've actually put this out. They're going to do they're going to monitor their news for artificially generated facts by artificial intelligence algorithms, so that the news that they report to you will be sure is truthful. Now, don't even get me started on all the problems that are inside of that.
Right.
But you want to talk about absurdity. There was an old guy way back in the day who was on the radio, and he said something very interesting. He used to say, and he was talking about it in terms of satire or parody, illustrating absurdity by being absurd. You don't even do that anymore. Like,
No.
there's no illustrating absurdity. The absurdity is here. Like, and it is that Camus, beyond Camus. This is beyond where even Camus thought that we could go. Because what the internet did was it tore down all the gatekeepers.
Not only that, absurd behavior is no longer a differentiator. That no longer distinguishes us from people in office to act
Right.
absurd.
Right. So now, when genuine evil shows up, and by the way, the people who tend to, you talked about Robert Hartman, the people who tend to recognize genuine evil aren't the bureaucrats. They're late to the game. They're
That's
always
exactly
late.
right.
They're always as Peter Thiel would say, the author of 0 to 1, they're always late adopters. They're always at the back end of the curve. Or as Hassan Zarels would say, they're the guy who shows up drunk at the party at like 3 o'clock when everyone's moved down the street to the after party by 4:30. Bureaucrats aren't going to do it.
No.
The people that we've set up in our, to your point, cult of personality or cult of youth, as I pointed out, aren't going to do it. The people who are going to recognize that genuine evil, again, I think it falls to the little people, and I wish it didn't. I wish that we had a different time, but I'm beginning to wonder, as I've done this podcast over the course of the last almost 2 years now, and read probably close to 50 or 60 books across different genres and different ways, and analyze them with guests. I'm beginning to wonder if let me kind of put this forward to you, if the strength of the West is that we recognize philosophically and socially, and yes, even morally and theologically, that there's always an apocalypse. And so we're driven to develop these solutions to this problem. But we don't all know the articulation in the correct way. So let me frame this in a way that maybe is more manageable, right? So if you are a person who is, I won't even go to married, if you're a person who's in an intimate relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever your situation is, right? There's a honeymoon period, and then the honeymoon period is over. And then we're all going to do the thing, we're going to figure it out, right? And and this is something, a principle I've told people before, if you can't figure out who somebody is in like 9 months, that's your answer to the question. Because like that's your interview. That's the entire thing, right? Well, just like time is a challenge for us, relationships are a challenge for us. This goes back to the communities of talent, right? But the problem is when you bring in other people, then you scale the opportunity for disaster. And so disaster is always around the corner. Whether you're with one other person, disaster is always around the corner. I've been married a little while. Like my wife and I, like we've figured out how to negotiate, but there is always a moment in any kind of negotiation where it's like, oh, disaster could be around the corner. Like, do I really want to bring up, what I did 10 years ago? Do I really want to bring up what she did 5 minutes ago? Or do I want to stay focused on just this thing right here?
To quote Billy Joel, have you ever let your lover see the stranger in yourself?
But is that a strength of the West? That we can do that at a microcosmic level, we can scale it up to a larger level, and we can move that up and down the scale quite, maybe not critically, but we do it quite easily. Like we're doing it in this conversation. We've been doing it the entire time we've been talking, right? We're going up, we're coming down, we're spreading out, we're coming in, right? Is that a strength of discourse in the West? Or is that something that's a real flaw that leads to trolls and narcissism and bad behavior.
I think right now the strength of the West, where we have gotten to, is our ability to be self-deprecating, is our ability finally to acknowledge.
You're saying we become more British. It's like a Monty Python.
Well, I mean, not Monty Python British, Faulty Towers British, certainly, but I think we have gotten to a point where we are still proud to be American.
Yeah,
because I am proud to be American, but are self-deprecating enough to acknowledge before someone else has to point it out that there's quite an absurd circus going on in our society.
Yeah,
I think we're there. I don't think we are yet at a point where we can have a discourse about it that does not involve us leaning on what our choice of political entertainment channel tells us we should believe.
Okay. Is that a function of this dictum that came out of the 1960s feminism, first wave feminism, and then, well, no, not first wave, because first wave was the 20s and 30s, sorry, second wave feminism, where they really leaned on the idea that the personal was political, which I think is an incredibly deleterious idea just in general. But they really leaned on that because they couldn't figure out a way. Andrea Dworkin was notorious for this, couldn't figure out a way to rile up enough of the homemakers to get feminism to work. Like, you hit a ceiling with that at a certain point. And even Dworkin, she was like, we got to get the homemakers. Like, we just do. And so how do you get the homemakers? Well, you move things that would have been in the realm of political and would have exclusively stayed there into the realm of the personal. And by the way, at an opportune moment when the churches are retreating from the public sphere, and by churches, I do mean denominational churches are retreating from the public sphere. They're saying, oh, okay, you don't want us involved in civil society? Cool beans. Let's retract, right? And there are people who will argue with me about this from the political progressive left. And I've heard your arguments and they're not convincing. The church has retreated from the public square. It has. And by the way, it's been a long, drawn out yawp going out for quite some time. As a matter of fact, probably the last yell of churches in the public square was the most recently, he's now recently deceased as of, like, I think a week ago, presidential candidate from 1993, I believe, Pat Robertson.
Yeah.
That was the last big yell, and it's been a long going out of the water, or the wave going out, right? So you can't really kick Jesus for this. Like, he's out of the square. The square is now occupied by the political. And it had to be, right, for feminism to work. But the knock-on effect of that is that now everything has to be reduced to the political realm. Using religious apocalyptic language, of course, but everything is now reduced to the political realm. Like, I mentioned political people on this show, and I mentioned political movements, but this show is not fundamentally political.
Right.
But someone who fundamentally believes the personal is political, and by the way, has never critically examined that, listens to this show and goes, oh, well, name your thing here. He's this.
Yeah.
Whatever.
And they reacted that way because it has been flipped, and now the political has become personal.
Right.
So, yeah.
So as leaders, and by the way, many leaders don't recognize this. I'm shocked at the number of leaders who do not recognize that this flip has happened. I'm stunned. And so when that person who is in that community of talent that's trying to achieve a common end comes to you with this thing that says we should make this statement about this thing, the leader is taken aback. Their response is not, that's a few people on the internet, that's a parallel track, who cares? I don't know. Although, interestingly enough, that's Elon Musk's.
Yeah.
That's his response.
Yeah, true.
Which is interesting. I find that to be incredibly fascinating.
Yeah.
That's his response. But invariably, you get these business leaders, and you're most recently seeing it with ESG stuff left and right, but you get these business leaders who are reacting, and it is reacting
That's exactly right.
reacting, not responding, reacting to things that are happening on a parallel track that have very little to do with what they're practically doing in their business. If your business is practically delivering beer to thirsty people, do you really need to have any kind of opinion at all about anything in the culture? You were never a cultural brand before. And by the way, you all know who I'm talking about here. The brand shall remain nameless.
Why do they need to put full page ads with their screed? I don't get it. Yes, I hear you.
But that's the logical end of the personal and the political flipping. Right. So it doesn't surprise me that people are only getting their religious beliefs from whatever network they're watching, or whatever YouTuber they happen to be following, or whatever podcast. Thank you, by the way, for whatever podcast they happen to be listening to. I'm not surprised by any of that. I'm not shocked. I'm not overwhelmed. I'm just wondering, how do leaders flip that script back? How do we convince people that no, those things that are political are over there? It is leveling them up in the hierarchy too high to bring them up to that level of transcendent. They need to be pushed down. How do we convince people of that? I don't know how we convince people. I don't know leaders do that work.
Yeah, well, and there is this organizational peer pressure to contribute to what they believe is the conversation.
What does that even mean? Really, what conversation where?
Well, because they're telling themselves it's a conversation. What they're really doing is adding to the noise. There is all this static. And I think for organizations that have not done the hard work of defining what at their core they are in business to accomplish, sell beer to thirsty people, they get into this reflexive reaction that compels them to get into the fray that is not theirs to get into.
Right. Sell beer to thirsty people. Here's another one. Play baseball 3 nights a week and try to win your division. Really just focus on that.
Right.
Or here's another one. Sell clothes to people who want to believe that they're middle class. Upmarket. Just sell upmarket clothes to people. Just like, not hard. Or here's another one. Sell me wood when I need it to like do a carpentry project. But that's all you got to do. Just that's literally, that's it. That's the whole thing. And the brands that understand this, and I don't, again, right, left, dead center, don't care. The brands that get this, they're fundamentally, maybe not at scale, but they're fundamentally doing better than Life Right Center. The brands that don't, like I as an observer of this 2-track problem, worry that the brands that are taking a particular position or posture, which again, most of which is marketing, because if you really get the people who are running those brands into a room off a hot mic without their Google phones or their Apple phones recording them, they're going to be like, what is this crap? Where did this come from? Which is fundamentally taken as a politically conservative position, but it's really not. It's just, what, can't I just focus on selling beer? Right. You know, my cinematic brain was back to Braveheart, The King and Braveheart, a great movie from Mel Gibson in 1995, where the king is going to his son, who's a wastrel, and well, anyway, he's a wastrel, and the kid has an advisor. The prince has an advisor, and the advisor starts talking to him about war. And the king, it was this great, I remember the Shakespearean actor who played the king in King Edward in Braveheart, but he was a great Shakespearean actor. And he says in the Shakespearean lilt, and I always think of it when I talk about these kinds of things, who is this person who's speaking to me as if I needed to hear his opinion? And then he proceeded to throw the kid out the window and killed him. So yeah, you know, well, I mean, that was medieval times. I mean, there was no Pepsi in medieval times. Thus, there's no Pepsi at medieval times. There's just people getting thrown out the window. So, like,
could you imagine post-COVID going to medieval times and eating with your hands among a mass of humanity? I mean,
oh my God. Well, those entire restaurants, that entire brand just got swept off.
yeah, I know. Did not make it.
Long drawn out.
But, and so you mentioned Shakespeare, so I have to channel my inner Macbeth, because that was probably my favorite Shakespearean work. And of course, I went to a high school where they forced us to memorize, whole passages and whatever. And one quote that keeps coming up for me that is very germane to Sisyphus and Camus and all of that is this, this whole monologue about life is but a poor player, right? Yep. That struts and frets this hour upon the stage and is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot. Full of sound and fury.
Signifying
nothing.
That's right.
Interesting. And I mean, I memorized that in high school. It stays with me to this day. And it is as true now as it was in the age of Shakespeare.
Well, this is like I said, this is the West. Maybe this is our secret skill. Maybe the secret of our success, historians, economists, philosophers, military folks, classicists. You ask any of them and they'll give you an answer about the why the West, quote unquote, succeeded versus other geographic parts of the world. Even though it started in a European context from way the hell back and just sort of like overtook everything else. This is one of the things in the early 2000s that Jared Diamond was very much consumed about, the guy who wrote Blood, Germs, and Steel. And a lot of other historians that came after Diamond were very much consumed with this idea of like, why are we talking about Western values? That doesn't make any sense. Why aren't we talking about Eastern values? And I think it's that argumentation piece. I think it's that sort of Monty Python / Faulty Towers sort of irony. I think it's that I think we can hold two thoughts in our heads, but we may not be able to articulate them. I do think we are in a specific cultural moment where that articulation is not nearly happening at mass. It's happening in pockets. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm part of one of those pockets. There's other folks who are parts of those pockets, names you would know. Most of them are on podcasts, but names you would know. Lex Friedman is part of one of those pockets, or Sam Harris, even, as much as I may philosophically disagree with him and his conclusions, he's part of that as well. Christopher Hitchens was part of those pockets, right? I think those pockets have occurred, but again, one of those detritus debris of the Industrial Revolution is the collapse of mass. So there's no mass anything now. There's no one voice. It's now all these multiple voices. But again, it's the same sort of Western ideal of, like the Venetians when the Ottoman Turks were showing up in the harbor in Vienna, they argued all the way up to the point of the catapult about what direction the catapult was going to go in. And I read that and I go, yeah, I mean, that sounds like 315 million people in a party in a can. That's precisely what that sounds like. But then, like, once the catapult goes, there's no more argument, because now apparently we're into something else. I mean, and we even saw this in our own country with the Iraq War. I mean, I remember all of the yelling and screaming and hyperventilating, and I remember all of it. I was actually a little bit more involved in politics than I am now, and I was writing policy papers about that for organizations and things like that, and examining and all that kind of good stuff from a bunch of different angles. And the yelling was ridiculous. And this was kind of in a weird middle pre-social media, and we didn't realize it at the time, but pre-social media sort of quiet moment when you could still sort of have this argumentation out loud, but you wouldn't lose friends because there wasn't flame roars or trolls going on.
Right.
And now we're into something else. But we had robust, but when George Bush said we're going, and we went, for 2 years in America, everybody, left, right, center, shut up. He was like, let's go do this. Okay, fine. We're going to go do this. That's the Venetians. That's the West. You just, once we decide, but it takes us, it takes us so long.
It does, but and I think to kind of come back to your original question, I think one of the lasting values or attributes, I guess, of the West is resilience. Right now, we are pointing out the absurdity of the times in which we're living, because these are the times in which we are living. Previous generations had their own version of absurdity, their own, expression of what was irrational or something that we were never going to live through. We will live through this. Maybe not you and I specifically live through this, but as a society, as the West, we will. This is but a phase, right? And the next phase of our evolution, whatever direction it goes, will be next. And I think the West has demonstrated over the millennia a resilience. Some of the crises, a lot of the crises are of our own making.
Oh, yeah.
But I think we have still demonstrated a resilience.
Well, I think it's amazing that I find it to be amazing that the United States, and you can make of this whatever you will, I find it to be amazing. The United States dropped 2 nuclear weapons to save the lives of potentially 100,000 Marines, so they could avoid a land invasion of Japan. And there hasn't been a nuke drop since. We've gotten close a few times. And now most nuclear weapons are on submarines. They're floating around underneath the ocean. Submarine can surface outside of the harbor of New York tomorrow, or, outside of LA harbor, right? Or outside of Seattle or New Orleans, right? And it'd be a real problem.
Well, in which case, the time we have wasted waiting for other people to have consequences thrust upon them will have been for naught.
Correct. That's right. And I do have hope, and I do take heart that there are some people.
Take that, Camus.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, bastard. Anyway.
That there are people who have recognized this, but again, I think they're in pockets, and I don't think their voices are large. I think they're in pockets. Who have recognized the seriousness of the moment, and are actively pushing in the opposite direction of fatalism, pushing in the opposite direction of narcissism, particularly malignant narcissism, and are not trying to necessarily unite the 2 tracks, but are saying we can have 2 tracks. Hell, we can even have 3, 4, or 5, and we don't have to get schizophrenic about it. As long as we understand what is Pache, the Matrix, what is real, what is objective truth, we can have that. And we've been yelling about objective truth for the last 120 years, but as long as we have that, and as long as we keep yelling about it, so at least we're having the conversation, or we're just yapping at each other. I mean, either whatever, however you want to frame it. If we're doing that act, we're okay, which is why free speech and free association still matter quite a bit. And I of course am a partisan for free speech, huge partisan for free speech, especially speech that makes me uncomfortable.
For those of you just listening, Hassan just grabbed the book again.
That's right. Back to the book. Last turn around the book.
Love it.
Last turn around the book. So we're going to read a couple of pages from here. We're going to wrap up. We're going to close because spent quite a bit of time with Claire today, and I want to thank her for coming on the podcast. And this was great. This was an awesome jog through a very difficult text. And I hope that we were able to gain some insights, or you were able to gain some insights from it, that you were actually going to be able to apply to your real lived leadership life. So back to the book. Back to the myth of Sisyphus, the chapter that merely is titled The Absurd Man. My field, said Goethe, is time. That is indeed the absurd speech. What, in fact, is the absurd man? He who, without negating it, does nothing for the eternal. Not that nostalgia is foreign to him, but he prefers his courage and his reasoning. The first teaches him to live without appeal and to get along with what he has. The second informs him of his limits. Assured of his temporary limited freedom, of his revolt devoid of future, and of his moral consciousness, he lives out his adventure within the span of his lifetime. That is his field, that is his action, which he shields from any judgment but his own. A greater life cannot mean for him another life. That would be unfair. I'm not even speaking here of that paltry eternity that is called posterity. Mademoiselle Roland relied on herself. That Rashus was taught a lesson. Posterity is glad to quote her remark, but forgets to judge it. Mademoiselle Roland is indifferent to posterity. There could be no question of holding forth on ethics. I've seen people behave badly with great morality, and I note every day that integrity has no need of rules. There is but one moral code that the absurd man can accept, the one that is not separated from God, the one that is dictated. But it so happens that he lives outside that God. As for the others, I mean also immoralism, the absurd man sees nothing in them but justifications, and he has nothing to justify. I start out here from the principle of his innocence. That innocence is to be feared. Everything is permitted, exclaims Ivan Karamazov. That too smacks of the absurd. By the way, pause. We will be reading portions of the Brothers Karamazov coming up here on the podcast shortly. Back to the book. That too smacks of the absurd, but on condition that it not be taken in a vulgar sense. I don't know whether or not it has been sufficiently pointed out that it is not an outburst of relief or of joy, but rather bitter acknowledgement of a fact. The certainty of a God giving a meaning to life far surpasses in attractiveness the ability to behave badly with impunity. That I agree with. Back to the book. The choice would not be hard to make. But there is no choice, and that is where the bitterness comes in. The absurd does not liberate, it binds. It does not authorize all actions. Everything is permitted does not mean that nothing is forbidden. The absurd merely confers an equivalence on the consequences of those actions. It does not recommend crime, for this would be childish, but it restores to remorse its futility. Likewise, if all experiences are indifferent, that of duty is as legitimate as any other. One can be virtuous through a whim. All systems of morality are based on the idea that an action has consequences that can legitimize or cancel it. A mind imbued with the absurd merely judges that those consequences must be considered calmly. It is ready to pay up. In other words, there may be responsible persons, but there are no guilty ones, in its opinion. At very most, such a mind will consent to use past experiences as a basis for its future actions. Time will prolong time, and life will serve life. In this field, that is both limited and bulging with possibilities. Everything in himself, except his lucidity, seems unforeseeable to him. What rule then could emanate from that unreasonable order? The only truth that might seem instructive to him is not formal. It comes to life and unfolds in men. The absurd mind cannot so much expect ethical rules at the end of its reasoning as rather illustrations and the breath of human lives. Life will serve life and time will serve time. Okay. Yes. At the end here, I'd like to reference C.S. Lewis, our episode that we did most recently about the abolition of man, a book you should absolutely pick up. And I mentioned Lewis previously, but Lewis and Camus both were looking at the same thing, but just through different lenses, right? So Camus was looking at absurdity, or was framing his structure of reality, his structuring of the explanation for what he was seeing at his time in Europe. He was framing it in terms of absurdity, whereas Lewis, who was a rock-ribbed atheist and then came to Christianity, framed his views through the lens of his service in World War I and the horrors that he saw in the trenches of Europe directly. He was a generation older than Camus, but they both came to the same conclusion. And the only problem that both Lewis and Camus had was that they couldn't complete the logic that led to the horror of the loss of meaning, combined with an odd species of, and it's interesting, we've kind of walked around it a little bit, but there's an odd species of Epicureanism that we now have in our culture. Matter of fact, I recently saw something where Epicureanism was being postured as a response to the Stoicism that now seems to be taking over certain leadership postures in the West, as if being stoic in the face of the absurd is going to be the thing. Okay, I mean, all right. Some people take that posture, not me, but some people take that posture. The opposite posture, of course, is Epicureanism. And by the way, if you don't know what that is, an Epicurean back in the day, back in the Greek day, was a person who believed that, well, everything was open to them and nothing was closed, which means that every appetite would be served by man. And now all of a sudden, the Twilight Zone episode where the aliens come down to serve man popped into my head right then. I love Rod Serling. That in itself is absurd. My brain is absurd. I think that's what we can maybe gain from this podcast.
You know, your encyclopedic knowledge of not just literature, but of pop culture is really, really exemplary. I applaud you. Awesome.
I'll tell you the same thing I tell my kids. Everything links to everything else.
That's
like
right.
in an irrevocable, unbreakable chain of being. Even the most absurd or ridiculous things can be linked in some sort of way to something else. I'm the ultimate like meme maker before memes came around. and so I look at Camus and I look at the Sisyphus, I look at the abolition of man. I look even at City of God, right, by Augustine, right? And I guess we've talked about everything and we've sort of run through all of the topics we had for today. And so I guess the only question that I have left is, Claire, how do leaders define the path of leadership and stay on it in this absurd environment? I don't know that our existences are absurd. I won't go that far. Camus would. And I don't think that suicide is an answer. I think he starts out provocatively and then backs away from it because he wanted to be provocative. And by the way, I feel like I should have made this entree or this point earlier in the podcast. I'm not approving of suicide. I've talked with people who are genuinely suicidal. I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about it from a philosophical perspective, as is Camus. How do leaders cut through all of this and stay on the path and keep their people on the path? How do they do that? If they're working at a bank in a rural area, or if they're working in a manufacturing company in, I already picked on Alabama, so let's pick on Mississippi, or they're working, in a high-rise bank building in New York, right? And they're tasked with these communities of talent. They're tasked with making something happen, and they're surrounded by these circumstances. How do they stay on the path?
Well, and I think the answer is not to embrace stoicism, which is something you referenced just a moment ago. And I don't think it is to take Camus' advice to sort of drain the emotional content, because I think, I sort of mentioned a couple hours ago now, sort of the difference between leaders who emerge from their executive office and try to convince you to follow them versus have been reflective enough and have done the inner work to be authentic to who they are and stand in that conviction. And I think that takes a certain level of passion. So it can't be the way of the Stoic to try to lead people and inspire them to follow you toward a collective good, which I think at the end of the day, organizations have to rally their communities of talent around achieving not just a common end, but a common end that does good in the world. Because we've had enough of evil. We've had enough of mediocrity. We have had enough of polarization and adding to the noise for the sake of you convincing yourself you have been heard. There is a greater call for leaders than that. Whether you are a leader of a bank, leader of an organization, a leader of a country, there is a greater call than that. And so I think it takes brave people doing hard things to get back to the core of not just what their organization is in existence to achieve, but what they as leaders have been put into that role to accomplish, to inspire, to catalyze, and to perhaps create. And they have to do that inner work. And it is very difficult the higher up the hierarchical ladder they get. because there is less time for them to be self-reflective. There is more demand on them to be on all the time, to be charismatic, to be influential, to be inspirational. And the only way that you can do that in a genuine way that resonates is to create capacity for that self-reflection. So I think that's the key. I think it is not in the stoicism. It's a little bit of that lucid indifference. And I only bring that up because I'm in love with that phrase. I love language, so I love that phrase. But don't confuse that with being dispassionate or being unemotional about what you do. If you don't have energy as a leader around what it is you are put in that position to lead, or the why that you are on the quest to pursue, Lord of the Rings style, then you shouldn't be doing it. And you should step aside and let someone else lead the charge.
I couldn't agree more, which means I could probably agree more.
Dude, come on.
I'm not going to agree more. I'm going to let that stand. Are there any places where we can get a hold of you? Any spots where you'd like people to take advantage of your talents and services, to find out what Talent Boost can do? Where can we find you? All the different places on the internet, Claire.
So of all the social networks, LinkedIn is the one I spend the most time on, but really the most direct way to connect with me is to go to clairechandler.net. You'll learn more about my work. You'll have links to some of these other podcast interviews. I have to say, this is the longest one I've ever been on, and without question, the most intellectually stimulating. So I appreciate just not only the opportunity, but the breadth and the depth through which you took this conversation. But yeah, come visit me on clairechandler.net. Interact with me. I'd love to connect with your audience, and you're not getting rid of me. I would love to stay connected to you. So let's definitely do that.
Absolutely. We will do that. And we will have links to clairechandler.net. We will have links to finding Claire Chandler on LinkedIn in the show notes below the podcast player. You know where the spot is.
Before or after the link to the Looney Tunes episode?
Probably after the link to the Looney
Okay, that's fine. I can follow Bugs Bunny. That's fine.
Yeah. We'll have it after the link to the Looney Tunes episode, and 4 other links. We're also going to link to a few other things, including a couple of our previous episodes on Thus Spake Zarathustra. I think it would be very informative for you all to listen to that, as we brought that one up. And of course, the link to the episode on Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. Once again, I'd like to thank Claire Chandler for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. And with that, we're out. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to podcasts on, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even Spotify. And please leave a 5-star review if you like the show. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to make sure that this show gets into the ears of the leaders who need to hear it. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing's products and services can help your team do that. Check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We also have a video-based subscription service, that's software as a service, that can help your team become better at the individual level. 60 modules and over 100 hours of video and written content for you at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com. We've also got books that will help you and your team grow. Pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 essays on disrupting your workplace by disrupting your boss, and subscribe to the Little Red podcast I launched earlier this year with the same name as that little red book. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership, co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan. This is the book for right now that was written for leaders right now. Pick up a copy by heading over to 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. That's 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. You pay for shipping, and you'll get a copy of my second book as well. Finally, you can get all these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place online you order books. Finally, HSCT Publishing is on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing and hit the subscribe button. You'll get our weekly video updates, which is the video version of this podcast. And of course, you're going to want to subscribe to my other podcast. That's right, I do more than one. The Hassan Sorrells Presents audio experience, where I talk more casually with a broader range of people about all matters that matter in the world today, from arts all the way to analytics. All right, that's it for me.